The train pulled away before she realized what she had done. Evelyn Hart stood on the platform of Seco Flats, New Mexico, in the October dust, watching the black tail of the locomotive disappear around a bend in the land, and felt something close to panic move through her chest like cold water. She turned once, slowly, taking in the town, if it could be called that. A general store with a warped porch, a saloon with a broken shutter hanging at an angle, a water trough that two bony horses were sharing without much enthusiasm, a sign nailed to a post that read, Seco Flats, Pop, 312, though someone had scratched through the number and written 308 below it, and then scratched through that too. She was supposed to be in Mill Haven. She pulled the folded letter from her coat pocket and read the top line again, as if it might have changed during the 3-day journey from Boston. Dear Miss Hart, I will await your arrival at Mill Haven Station on the 14th of October. She looked at the letter. She looked at the sign. Mill Haven was 22 miles east. She had been half asleep when the conductor walked the aisle, calling out stops, and she had heard the word haven in her fog of exhaustion and stood up without thinking, gathered her case, and walked off the train like a woman who knew exactly where she was going. She did not know where she was going. That had always been, if she was honest with herself, the central problem of her life. She sat down on her suitcase. The leather strap groaned but held. A man in a canvas apron was sweeping the general store's porch with the slow deliberateness of someone who had nowhere else to be. He watched her without pretending not to. A woman in a sun-faded dress crossed the street, glanced at Evelyn's traveling clothes, the fitted gray jacket, the good hat with the small silk flower on the brim, and looked quickly away, the way people look away from things that don't belong. Evelyn pressed her lips together. She was 27 years old. She had taught 40 children their letters and sums in a brick schoolhouse on Alderton Street for 4 years. She had buried her mother, managed her father's household until he remarried a woman who didn't want her in it, and she had answered a matrimonial advertisement in a respectable newspaper because it seemed like the most practical, available solution to the problem of being alone in the world without sufficient money to stay that way comfortably. She had not come this far to sit in the dirt and feel sorry for herself. She stood up, picked up her suitcase, and walked toward the general store. The man with the broom stopped sweeping when she reached the bottom step. He was 60 or so, with a face like old bark and small, sharp eyes that weren't unkind. "Help you?" he said. "I hope so," Evelyn said. "I've gotten off at the wrong station. I'm meant to be in Mill Haven. Is there a stage or a wagon that goes that way?" The man considered this at some length. "Stage comes through Tuesdays. Today is Thursday." "Yes, ma'am, it is." Evelyn set her suitcase down. "Is there anyone traveling east? Anyone at all who might carry a passenger?" The man scratched his chin. "Ben Alcott hauls lumber out to Mill Haven sometimes, but he went last Monday. Won't go again for 2-3 weeks. He paused. "Could rent a horse at Gruber's stable." "I don't ride," Evelyn said. This was true. It was also, she recognized, an absurd limitation for someone who had just voluntarily moved to New Mexico territory. "Telegram office is down past the saloon," he offered. "Could wire somebody to come get you." She hadn't thought of that. Of course she hadn't. She'd been too busy sitting on her suitcase feeling the ground fall away beneath her. "Yes," she said. "That would do. Thank you." The telegram office was a narrow room with a warped wood counter and a young man behind it, who couldn't have been more than 18, with ears too large for his face and ink on 3 of his fingers. She wrote out her message to Mr. Gerald Marsh of Mill Haven Ranch. Delayed. Arrived Seco Flats in error. Please advise. And paid the fee from her coin purse, which had less in it than she would have liked. "How long for a reply?" she asked. "Could be an hour. Could be tomorrow," the young man said. "Depends on whether anyone's at the other end." She thanked him and stepped back out into the afternoon. The sun was lower than she expected. The air had turned cool with the particular crispness she associated with high country, with altitude and dry grass and sky that was somehow bigger than sky anywhere else. She stood on the plank sidewalk with her suitcase at her feet and tried to calculate her situation. She had money enough for perhaps 2 nights at a boarding house, if such a thing existed here. She had a letter from a man she had never met promising her a home and a future, which was currently 22 miles away and inaccessible. She had a hat with a silk flower on it, which was doing nothing useful. She was considering whether the saloon might at least sell her a cup of coffee when she heard running footsteps, and then something small and determined collided with her left leg. Evelyn stumbled, caught herself on the wall of the telegraph office, and looked down. A child stared up at her. A girl, 7 or 8 years old, with dark hair escaping from 2 messy braids and a smear of what appeared to be jam on her left cheek. She was wearing a dress that had been mended at the hem twice, brown boots, and an expression of such absolute and immediate certainty that Evelyn felt slightly alarmed by it. "You're here," the girl said. Evelyn looked around, wondering if she was speaking to someone else. There was no one else. "I beg your pardon?" "You're here," the girl said again. She said it the way people state facts, not questions. "The sky is blue, the water is cold. You're here." "I am," Evelyn agreed carefully. "I'm afraid I'm a bit lost, actually." The girl frowned at this. "You don't look lost." She tipped her head to one side, studying Evelyn with an intensity that was nearly uncomfortable. "You look like a teacher." "I am a teacher," Evelyn said, startled. "How did you—" "You have chalk on your coat," the girl said, pointing to Evelyn's sleeve. There was, indeed, a faint white streak near the cuff, left over from her last day in the Boston schoolroom. Evelyn had not noticed it until now. She felt obscurely embarrassed. "Very observant," she said. The girl nodded as if this were simply her due. "My name is Lucy Reed. My papa is Caleb Reed, and we have the big ranch on the north side past the cottonwoods, and I've been waiting for you." Evelyn blinked. "I'm sorry?" "I prayed for a mother," Lucy said. Just like that. Straight out, the way children say things that adults spend years learning to pad with caution and softness. I prayed, and now you're here." Evelyn felt something move in her chest. Not quite discomfort, not quite tenderness, somewhere in between. She crouched down to the girl's level, which put her eye to eye with that fierce, certain little face. "Lucy," she said gently, "I think there may be a misunderstanding. I don't know your papa. I've only just arrived in this town, and I wasn't even supposed to arrive here. I'm trying to get to Mill Haven." Something flickered in Lucy's eyes. Not quite doubt, more like a recalibration. "Mill Haven's far." "I know. You can't get there today." "I know that too." Lucy studied her for another long moment. "You can come home with us then," she said, as if this were the obvious and logical conclusion. "Papa won't mind." "I don't think—" "He doesn't like strangers," Lucy said, with the cheerful honesty of someone reporting weather. "But you could stay in the barn if he minds too much. It's a good barn. I sleep out there sometimes when I want to think." Evelyn didn't know whether to laugh or feel sorry for her. "Where's your papa now?" "Picking up flour from Mr. Hennessy's store," Lucy said. "He'll be done in a minute. You should meet him before he gets the wrong idea." "What wrong idea would that be?" "That you're trouble," Lucy said simply. "People who don't know you think you're trouble when you just show up." Evelyn stood. The sun was dropping fast, and there was no hotel that she could see, and her choices were narrowing with the light. She looked at the girl, at the jam-smeared cheek and the determined braids, and the utterly serene conviction in her eyes, and thought, this is what 7 years old looks like when it has decided something. "All right," Evelyn said. "I'll wait. She did not have to wait long. He came out of Hennessy's general store carrying a 50-pound flour sack over one shoulder like it weighed nothing. A man who looked like he had been assembled by the landscape itself, broad shoulders, sun-darkened skin, dark hair that needed cutting, a jaw that looked like it had been set against something for a long time and hadn't found a reason to stop. He was not old, but he looked like a man who had spent years doing work that age you past your number. He saw Lucy first, and his whole face shifted in a way that Evelyn noticed. Not softened exactly, but changed. Like something in him that was braced all the time, relaxed a fraction when his eyes landed on his daughter. Then he saw Evelyn. The fraction closed back up. "Lucy," he said. The word was measured. "Papa, this is Miss—" Lucy looked at Evelyn. "What's your name?" "Evelyn Hart." "Miss Evelyn Hart," Lucy continued with great dignity. "She got off at the wrong station, and she needs somewhere to stay, and I told her she could come to our ranch." Caleb Reed set the flour sack down on the porch railing. He looked at Evelyn the way a man looks at something he's not sure whether to trust, steadily, without apology. That true? He said. About the wrong station? I'm afraid so, Evelyn said. I'm trying to reach Millhaven. I've sent a telegram, but there's no stage until Tuesday, and I haven't. She stopped herself before she said, I haven't enough money for a long wait. She was not going to say that to a stranger. I was told there's no transport until next week. Who told you that? The man at the general store. He glanced toward Hennessy's. Old Dunn, he said. He's right. He looked at her again, not rudely, but not warmly either, with the frank appraisal of someone who had learned to assess situations quickly and didn't bother with social lubrication. You're not from here. Boston, she said. Long way to go wrong. Yes. A pause. Lucy had positioned herself between them with the strategic intuition of a child who understood that her presence was a kind of argument. Caleb looked down at his daughter, then back at Evelyn. Something in his expression shifted again. Not quite reluctance, not quite resignation. More like a man doing mental arithmetic. We've got a spare room, he said, finally. It was my sister-in-law's when she visited. It's not much. I wouldn't expect much, Evelyn said. That seemed to settle something for him, though she couldn't tell what. I'm heading back now, he said. You want a ride? You can have one. It was not the warmest invitation she had ever received, but Lucy took Evelyn's hand before she could answer, threading small fingers through hers with the casual totality of a child who has decided something is already true, and Evelyn thought, well, all right then. The Reed Ranch was 3 miles north of town, past a stand of cottonwoods that were dropping their last leaves in the late afternoon light. The wagon ride was largely silent. Lucy sat between them on the bench seat, talking about everything. The names of the horses, Biscuit and Tom, the way the creek ran low in October, a family of roadrunners that had taken up residence near the south fence, the fact that her teacher in town had left in September and no one had replaced her yet. Caleb drove and said nothing. Evelyn sat on the other side of Lucy and looked at the land. She had not expected it to be beautiful. She had expected it to be hard and brown and vast, which it was, but she hadn't expected the light, the way the late sun turned the mesa to the west a color that wasn't quite gold and wasn't quite red, or the way the shadows lay long and blue across the pale grass, or the smell of sage and dust and something drier underneath everything that she had no name for. She had lived her whole life in a city of brick and cobblestone and elms, and this openness was like a door left unexpectedly wide. Pretty, she said, without meaning to say it aloud. Caleb glanced sideways at her, just briefly. Some think so, he said. Don't you? Another pause. Used to, he said, and then nothing more. The ranch house was low and long, made of adobe with a wood porch running along the front. It had the look of a place that had been added to over time, each addition practical rather than planned, so that the whole thing had a particular kind of honest ungainliness about it. There were chickens in the yard. A gray dog came off the porch at a trot to greet the wagon, tail working. That's Pepper, Lucy announced. He bites sometimes, but not meanly. Lucy, Caleb said. It's true, though, Lucy said. He helped Evelyn down from the wagon without ceremony, which she appreciated more than she expected. The inside of the house was clean in the way that things are clean when someone works hard at it without having much help. There was a main room with a table and 4 chairs, a stone fireplace, a sideboard with 2 mismatched lamps on it, a braided rug on the floor that had been good once and was worn through in the walking paths, a child's drawings pinned to the wall near the window, the figures blocky and cheerful, one of them clearly a horse with a disproportionate smile. The spare room was off the back hall. Caleb opened the door and she saw a narrow bed with a quilt on it, a washstand, a hook on the wall, a window that faced the back fence, and a stretch of brown grass beyond it. It was small. It was clean. It was private. Thank you, she said. Truly, he nodded, already turning away. Supper's at 6, he said. Lucy, don't let her carry that case. He stopped, but it was too late. Lucy had already tried to lift Evelyn's suitcase and dropped it with a thump. I've got it, Evelyn said, picking it up before either of them could fuss. Caleb stood in the doorway for a moment, one hand on the frame. If the telegram gets through and whoever's coming for you sends word, Hennessy will send someone out, he said. We're 3 miles. It's not far. I know I'm putting you out, she said. You're not putting me out. he said, which she could tell was not entirely true but was also not entirely untrue, which she appreciated for its honesty. It's one night, maybe two. Maybe two, she agreed. He left. She heard his boots on the wood floor going toward the kitchen, and then the sound of a fire being laid, and then Lucy's voice asking something she couldn't make out, and then silence. Evelyn sat on the edge of the narrow bed. She looked at her suitcase. She looked at the hook on the wall. She looked at the window and the brown grass and the sky above it going pink at the western edge. She thought about Gerald Marsh, 22 miles east. She had exchanged letters with him for 7 months, careful, courteous letters, his written in a precise hand, hers in the looping script of someone trained to write in front of children. He had told her about the ranch and the cattle and the house, and he had asked about her school and her background, and they had been unfailingly polite to one another in a way that she recognized now, sitting in this other man's spare room, as the politeness of two strangers negotiating a contract. There had been nothing wrong in any of it. But there had also been, she was aware, very little that felt like anything at all. She did not let herself follow that thought any further. It was not productive. She unpacked her nightgown and her washing things and her books. She had brought 3, a novel she hadn't finished, a text on American geography that she'd intended to brush up on during the journey, and a small volume of poetry that had belonged to her mother. She set them on the edge of the washstand and looked at them. Then she went to see if she could be useful in the kitchen. She found a situation that needed untangling. The fire in the stove was too high for what Caleb was trying to do, which appeared to be boiling salt pork and potatoes in the same pot in a way that was going to result in something technically edible, but not much more. There was also a pan of cornbread that had been left on the back of the stove and was on its way to becoming hardtack. She stood in the kitchen doorway and took all this in without saying anything for a moment. Caleb was at the stove with his back to her, and he wasn't a man who moved with waste. Even doing something as simple as adjusting a pot, he was economical, and she could see from the way the kitchen was arranged, the hanging tools, the organized dry goods shelf, that he had managed this household for some time without help. There was competence here. There was also, underneath it, a weariness in the set of his shoulders that he wouldn't have known he was showing. "Can I help?" she said. He turned. His expression was not unwelcoming, but it was careful. "You're a guest." "I'm a trespasser who arrived without warning," she said. "Let me move the cornbread." He looked at her for a moment, and something in him appeared to decide something. He stepped aside. She moved the cornbread pan to the lower shelf, still warm enough to finish without burning, and adjusted the flame under the main pot and found a wooden spoon on the hook by the window. "Do you have onions?" she asked. "In the cellar." "May I?" "Go ahead." She did not ask again. She found the onion cellar door in the floor near the back wall and went down and came back up with 2 onions and a handful of dried herbs she spotted hanging from a nail. When she came back to the stove, Caleb was sitting at the table watching her in a way that was not unfriendly exactly, more like someone watching a thing they hadn't expected, trying to calibrate. "Boston teacher who cooks," he said. "Teacher who had to feed herself," she said. "Different thing." Lucy appeared from the back room with Pepper at her heels and climbed into a chair at the table, watching Evelyn work with the bright, unblinking attention of a child who finds everything interesting. "Do you know any songs?" she asked. "Lucy," Caleb said. "I do," Evelyn said. "What kind do you like?" "Sad ones," Lucy said promptly. Evelyn glanced at her. "Sad ones?" "The sad ones are better," Lucy said, with the authority of someone who has thought this through. "The happy ones are too fast." Evelyn found herself smiling, which she hadn't expected. "I know a sad one about a river," she said. "I'll sing it after supper if you like." Lucy nodded with great seriousness, as if this had been agreed in a negotiation. Supper was better than it would have been. Not elegant. The pork was pork, and the potatoes were potatoes. But the onions and herbs had done something, and the cornbread had come back from the edge of disaster, and the 3 of them sat at the table in the lamplight and ate. Caleb asked her once how long she'd taught. She said 4 years. He nodded. She asked him once how long he'd ranched. He said all his life, which she took to mean he'd been born into it rather than chosen it, which wasn't quite the same thing, and she didn't press further. Lucy ate with one hand and kept her other hand in Pepper's fur under the table. And she told them both about the Roadrunner family again, with additional detail about a particularly bold member she had named Captain, and about a boy at school the previous year who had put a lizard in the teacher's drawer and the trouble that had followed. The story was funny. Caleb didn't laugh outright, but the corner of his mouth moved, and Evelyn thought that was probably close. After supper, while Caleb took the dishes to the wash basin, Evelyn sat with Lucy by the fire and sang the sad river song. An old New England ballad her mother had sung, about a woman waiting at the water's edge for a man who doesn't come back. And Lucy listened with her chin on her knees and her eyes half closed, the dog pressed against her side. When it was done, Lucy looked up at her. "He doesn't come back, does he?" she said. "In the song." "No," Evelyn said. "He doesn't." "Did she wait a long time?" "I think so. The song doesn't say." Lucy thought about this. "It's better that she waited," she said finally, "even if he didn't come." Evelyn looked at her, at this small, odd, clear-eyed girl, and felt something that she couldn't name exactly, but that settled in her chest like something finding a place it hadn't known it was looking for. "Yes," she said. "I think so too." Caleb came back from the kitchen and told Lucy it was time for bed, which Lucy accepted with surprising grace, probably because she'd gotten the song she wanted. She hugged Evelyn goodnight with the same unstudied totality with which she'd taken her hand on the street. No hesitation, no calculation, just arms and the slight weight of her, and then she was gone down the hall. Caleb stood by the fireplace, one hand on the mantel, looking at the fire. He'd taken off his work jacket, and the lamp threw his shadow long against the wall. "She doesn't do that with people generally," he said. "Hug them? Take to them." He glanced at her. Her mother died 4 years ago. She was 3. She doesn't remember her, not really, but she... He stopped, started again. She decided pretty early that she was going to find someone to fill the place. She's done it with the widow parson, and the school teacher, and the woman who brings the eggs on Fridays. His voice was flat, but not unkind. Factual. Like he was telling her the weather. "I'm not saying that to... I just want you to know that it's not personal. About you specifically." Evelyn looked at him. "And if it were personal?" she said. He looked at her then fully, which he hadn't quite done before. His eyes were dark brown, and there was something in them she hadn't anticipated. Not hostility, not the wariness she'd seen on his face outside Hennessy's. Something older. Something that had been through something. "Wouldn't change anything," he said. "You've got somewhere to be." "I do," she said. A pause. Outside the wind had come up, and somewhere on the property a gate or a shutter was loose, knocking at irregular intervals. "I'll look at the gate in the morning," he said, as if she'd said that aloud. "Thank you," she said, "for all of this. I mean it." He nodded, already turning toward the back of the house, toward whatever it was a man did alone at the end of a day, in a house where only the daughter talked freely. "Good night, Miss Hart," he said. "Evelyn," she said. "Please." He paused at the doorway. "Evelyn," he said, quietly, like he was trying the word. Then he was gone. She sat alone by the fire for a while. The gate knocked. Pepper came back from Lucy's room and lay down near her feet with a heavy sigh. The fire settled. She thought about the telegram she'd sent, about Gerald Marsh and his precise handwriting and his polite letters, about the ranch in Mill Haven she'd agreed to go to and the life she'd agreed to live, neither of which she'd seen or touched or felt anything particular about a woman who had gotten on a train in Boston with a suitcase and a letter and a plan, and had ended up here, in the wrong place, in front of the right fire, with a stranger's dog asleep against her shoe. She didn't let herself think too much further than that. She was tired, and the situation was what it was, and she was not the kind of woman to fall into something sentimental after one evening. But when she finally went to bed in the narrow spare room with the quilt and the hook on the wall, she lay awake for a while longer than she expected, listening to the wind, thinking about Lucy's voice saying, "You're here," like it was a fact that had already been decided, like the world had arranged it, and the only thing left to do was show up and admit it. Oh, the telegram reply came the next afternoon. The boy from the telegraph office rode out with it on a spotted pony, and Evelyn read it in the yard while Caleb was fixing the loose gatepost and Lucy was chasing the dog around the water trough. Miss Hart. Delayed notification is unfortunate. Arrangements have been complicated by your error. I trust you have found adequate temporary accommodation. We'll arrange transport by next Thursday if stage is unavailable. G. Marsh. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket. Your error. That was fair, technically. It had been her error. She'd heard what she wanted to hear and stepped off the train and walked into the wrong life. She knew that. But she stood there in the October yard with the sun coming down warm on her shoulders, and Lucy Reed shrieking with laughter somewhere behind her, and Caleb Reed driving a post with a maul in steady, unhurried strokes. And she thought about how a letter could be technically fair and still feel like a cold room. Bad news? Caleb said. He hadn't looked up from the post. No, she said. Not exactly. She tucked the telegram deeper into her pocket. Mr. Marsh will arrange transport by Thursday. Caleb drove the post once more, set the maul down, tested the post's steadiness with both hands, rocking it slightly. That's almost a week. Yes. He looked at her then, and she couldn't read exactly what was in his face, but it wasn't nothing. You're welcome to stay, he said, if it's not an imposition to you. It's not an imposition to me, she said. All right, he said, and picked up the maul again. Lucy, having heard the last part of this, appeared from behind the water trough with her hair entirely undone from its braids and a victorious expression on her face, and announced, "Good," with the confidence of someone who had already known how it was going to go. Caleb looked at his daughter, a long, suffering sort of look, but not without love. Go fix your hair, he said. It'll just fall out again, Lucy said. Go fix it anyway. She went, dragging her feet philosophically. Pepper trotted after her. Evelyn looked at the gate, at the mended post, at the man who'd mended it without making anything of it, at the wide sky going gold in the west, and the cottonwoods and the length of the afternoon still ahead. She thought, I'll go on Thursday. She thought, there is a whole week between now and Thursday. She turned and went back inside to start the water for supper. The first full day passed, and then the second, and by the third, Evelyn had stopped thinking of herself as a person waiting and had started thinking of herself as a person doing things, which was more natural to her anyway. She was not built for waiting. She was built for doing, for moving, for finding what needed to be done and doing it without making it a bigger matter than it was. She reorganized the dry goods shelf in the kitchen with Caleb's permission, which he gave with a shrug that she took as genuine indifference. She found a hole in Lucy's dress hem and mended it. She taught Lucy 3 new words each morning, real words, not child's words, words with weight to them, and Lucy repeated them with the solemn concentration of someone taking a vow. On the third morning, it was fortitude, tenacity, melancholy. Melancholy, Lucy said, trying the syllables. That's a better word for sad. It is, Evelyn said. It means sad with a kind of weight to it, not just sad, sad that stays. Lucy looked at the word like she was turning it over. Papa has that, she said. Evelyn didn't answer for a moment. Does he? After Mama, Lucy said. Not sad about it, just noting it. He laughed more before. I don't really remember, but Mrs. Parson told me. She looked up at Evelyn. Do you have it? Sometimes, Evelyn said honestly. Less than I used to. Lucy nodded, satisfied with this. You should stay longer than Thursday, she said. Lucy, I know you have somewhere to be, Lucy said, in an almost perfect imitation of her father's tone. I'm just saying. Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. The morning light was coming through the window and Lucy's hair was already escaping its braids again, and there was last night's biscuit in her hand, and she was looking at Evelyn with a directness that no adult had looked at her with in a very long time. I know you're just saying, Evelyn said. The mornings were the best. Caleb left early for the ranch work, and it was just the 2 of them in the kitchen with the stove warm and the light coming in, and Lucy would eat whatever Evelyn made and ask questions about everything. About Boston, about the ocean, about whether it was true that cities had streets lit with gas lamps, about what books were about whether Evelyn had ever been frightened. That last one was asked with great casualness, as if it didn't matter, which meant it mattered very much. Yes, Evelyn said, lots of times. Of what? She thought. Of being in the wrong place, she said. Of having made a mistake I couldn't fix. Lucy chewed her biscuit. Like getting off at the wrong station? Among other things. But you fixed it, Lucy said. You're here. There it was again. You're here. Said as if being here were itself the fix, as if the wrong station had been the destination all along. Evelyn didn't know what to do with that. She was not a sentimental person, or she hadn't thought she was, but there was something about the way this girl said it that moved through her defenses the way cold water moves through cloth. The afternoons were more complicated. Caleb came back at midday for an hour, ate quickly, didn't talk much. Not from rudeness, she understood that now, but from habit. From years of a house where conversation was one-directional, from a daughter who talked enough for two people, from the particular silence of a man who had had someone to talk to and didn't anymore, and hadn't figured out how to start again with anyone else. She didn't push. She had not come here to push. She set a plate in front of him and said things that required only yes or no for an answer, and he said yes or no. And sometimes he said something more, and she counted those moments without counting them. On the fourth day, he came back at midday, and she was in the yard with Lucy, who was attempting to show her how to throw a rope with a loop at the end. Lucy's technique was enthusiastic and extremely inaccurate. Evelyn's technique was worse. She'd thrown the rope twice and hit herself in the shin once and caught a fence post the second time, which Lucy had congratulated her on as if it were a legitimate achievement. Caleb stopped at the edge of the yard and watched them. "You're holding it too far back," he said. Evelyn turned. "I beg your pardon?" He came across the yard and without ceremony or preamble took the rope from her and showed her, not slowly, not teacherly, just the way a person shows something to another person because the instruction is easier than the explanation. His hands adjusted the coil and the loop, and then he handed it back. "Further up, let the weight do it." She tried. The rope went out in something closer to a real throw. Didn't catch anything, but didn't hit her shin either. "Better," he said, which she understood was high praise. Lucy said, "I taught her the first part." "I can see that," he said. He went inside, and when he came back out with his coffee, he sat on the porch step and watched them, and didn't leave right away. And Lucy showed off for him. And Evelyn watched the small scene of a father watching his daughter with that complicated love that parents have, so proud of everything, tired of everything, frightened of everything, all at once. And she thought, this is a good man who has forgotten, somewhere along the way, that he is. Thursday approached with the weight of a weather front. On Wednesday evening, after Lucy was in bed, Caleb sat at the kitchen table with a lamp and a ledger, going over numbers that didn't seem to be making him happy. Evelyn sat across from him with her geography book open on the table, but not really reading it, and the fire cracked and the wind pushed at the windows, and the silence between them had changed over the week from awkward to something else. Something more like the silence between people who don't need to fill every space. "It's been a good week," she said finally. "Not fishing, just saying." He looked up from the ledger. "For you?" "For me," she said. "I think also—" She stopped. "What?" She looked at the ledger, at the numbers he'd been frowning at. "Also for Lucy," she said, because that was safe and true. He looked at her for a moment. The lamp between them lit his face from the side and she could see the tiredness in it, the real deep tiredness that has nothing to do with sleep. "She'll miss you," he said. "I'll miss her," Evelyn said honestly. "She'll be—" He put the pencil down. He looked at the ledger without seeing it. "She'll be fine," he said. "She always is. She's—" He searched for the word. "Resilient. Is that the right word?" "It's the right word," Evelyn said. "But you don't have to make it sound like a good thing when you're worried about her." He looked at her. "I'm not worried." Caleb. The name stopped him. She hadn't used it before. It had always been Mr. Reed, and she hadn't quite realized that until now, and neither had he, and they both felt it, the shift in the room. "She misses her mother," he said quietly. "Every day she builds something out of whatever's nearby to put in that place. I know she does it. I can't—" He spread one hand flat on the table, then picked up the pencil again. "I can't give her that." "You give her everything else," Evelyn said. "Not everything." "No," she agreed. "Not everything, but close." He didn't respond to that. He went back to the ledger. She went back to her book. The fire settled and the wind ran around the eaves, and somewhere Pepper shifted in his sleep and made a small sound. Outside, in the direction of town, a coyote called once, high and carrying, and then stopped. Evelyn turned a page she hadn't read. Tomorrow was Thursday. In the morning, before Caleb had come back from the early chores, a boy rode out from town with a message. Not a telegram this time, a letter, hand-delivered by the youngest Gruber boy, who accepted the coin Evelyn gave him with a solemn nod and rode back without additional comment. She opened the letter at the kitchen table. Lucy was eating her oatmeal. The morning light was doing what it always did. Dear Miss Hart, I have made arrangements for Mr. Holt to collect you in his wagon on Friday morning, not Thursday as previously indicated. I trust one additional day is manageable. I have some concerns I would address before your arrival that I prefer to put in writing rather than on the telegraph. I had expected, upon reflection, a woman somewhat more suited to immediate domestic establishment. Your background is satisfactory, but I wonder if you have fully considered the practical realities of ranch life in this territory and whether your particular skills translate to what is required here. I do not mean any unkindness by this. I only think it prudent that we enter this arrangement with clear expectations. G. Marsh. Evelyn read it twice. She set it face down on the table. Whether your particular skills translate to what is required here. She thought about the week she had just spent. She thought about the cornbread she had rescued and the dress she had mended and Lucy's vocabulary growing word by word each morning. She thought about a rope thrown inaccurately into the yard and getting better. She thought about the geography of this landscape working its way into her without her inviting it. She was not angry, or rather she was, but under the anger there was something else, a cold, clarifying certainty, the kind you get when something you'd been trying not to see becomes impossible to look away from. She had made a plan. She had made the plan because it had seemed like the responsible thing to do, the practical thing, the thing a woman in her position did when she was alone in the world and needed it to change. She had made the plan and she had been faithful to the plan, and she had not let herself admit, until this moment, that she had been faithful to it, the way you're faithful to something you're not sure you believe in. Evelyn? Lucy said. Is something wrong? She looked at Lucy's face across the table, the oatmeal, the morning light. No, she said. And then more honestly, I don't know yet. She folded the letter, put it in her pocket, got up and poured more coffee and stood at the window looking at the yard, at the fence post that Caleb had fixed, at the cottonwoods at the edge of the property turning gold in the light. She had gotten off at the wrong station. She still didn't know, not exactly, what the right one was, but she was beginning to have a thought about it. A persistent, inconvenient, gathering thought, the kind that starts quiet and doesn't stop getting louder. She kept it to herself. She wasn't the kind of woman to act on a thought before she'd thought it all the way through. And there was still Friday to get through, and Mr. Holt's wagon, and 22 miles of road, and a man with precise handwriting who had concerns he'd preferred to put in a letter. She would think it all the way through. But she stood at that window for a long time before she moved. Friday morning arrived gray and cold, with a thin cloud cover that turned the light flat and made the cottonwoods look silver instead of gold. Evelyn had been awake before the sun, lying in the narrow bed with her hands folded on her chest, staring at the ceiling and doing what she'd told herself she was going to do, thinking it all the way through. She thought about Gerald Marsh's letter. She read it again in her head, every careful, measured sentence of it, and tried to be fair about it. A man had placed an advertisement. A woman had answered it. Certain expectations had been established on both sides. That was the arrangement, and arrangements deserved to be honored. And she was not a person who walked away from things she'd agreed to simply because they'd become inconvenient or because she'd spent a week somewhere that felt unexpectedly like something. That was what she told herself while she packed her suitcase in the gray light before breakfast. She was lifting the case to carry it to the main room when she heard Lucy in the kitchen talking to the dog. Lucy always talked to Pepper in the mornings, a low-running commentary on the day's plans and grievances, delivered with the seriousness of a person reporting the news. This morning, the commentary was quieter than usual. Evelyn stood in the hallway and listened, not meaning to eavesdrop. She's going today, Lucy was telling the dog. I know she has to, Papa said. A pause. I'm not sad. I'm just saying. Evelyn stood there for a moment with the suitcase in her hand. Then she set it down quietly in the hall and went to the kitchen. Lucy looked up from the dog. Her expression was arranged carefully into something neutral, which on a 7-year-old face was not entirely convincing. "Good morning," Evelyn said. "Good morning," Lucy said. She scratched Pepper's ears. "I already put the kettle on." "Thank you. You'll want coffee before the wagon comes." "I will," Evelyn said. She moved to the stove and checked the kettle and got the coffee down from the shelf, going through the familiar motions of the week, which already had the shape of habit. That was the strange thing about a week, how quickly it could become familiar. How quickly a shelf could feel like your shelf, and a fire could feel like your fire, and a child's voice in a kitchen could feel like something you'd known longer than 7 days. She made the coffee and poured 2 cups and set one in front of Lucy, who wrapped both hands around it like a much older person. Lucy had been drinking weak coffee with plenty of milk since she was 5, a fact Evelyn had discovered on the second day, and which Caleb had shrugged about when she'd mentioned it, saying she likes it and it doesn't hurt her. They sat at the table. Outside, a wind had picked up, and the flat clouds were moving east. "You'll write?" Lucy said. Not asking for a promise exactly, more like asking if it was within the realm of things that could happen. "I'll write," Evelyn said. Lucy looked at her coffee. "Where do I send letters back?" "I don't know the address." Evelyn hesitated. She realized she didn't know the address either. She had the name of the ranch, Millhaven Ranch, but she'd never written the physical address down anywhere, and it struck her now as a small telling gap in what she knew about the life she was going to. "I'll send you the address once I'm settled," she said. Lucy nodded. Pepper put his head in her lap. Evelyn drank her coffee and looked at the light through the window, and neither of them said anything more. And the silence was the kind that comes at the end of something, full of the weight of everything that had been and wasn't going to be. At least not in this form. Caleb came in from the early chores when the sky was still pale. He'd clearly already known what morning it was. There was something in the way he carried himself, a settled quality, like a man who'd already had the conversation with himself that needed having. He poured his own coffee. He looked at Evelyn's suitcase in the hall. He said nothing about it. He sat at the table and they ate the biscuits Evelyn had made. She'd gotten up early enough to make them, not because it was expected, just because she'd wanted to. And the 3 of them ate together for the last time in a way that felt like the last time, and nobody pretended otherwise. "The Gruber boy said Holt usually runs late," Caleb said, which was the most generous thing he could offer without offering anything more. "I'll wait," Evelyn said. He nodded. He ate. He looked at the middle distance once, the way a person does when they're keeping something from going any further than their own chest. Mr. Holt's wagon arrived an hour and a half late, which gave them an hour and a half of pretending it was an ordinary morning. Lucy showed Evelyn a drawing she'd been working on, which turned out to be of Evelyn, identifiable by the hat with the silk flower, standing in the yard. The flower's very large relative to the hat. Evelyn's arms extended in the position of someone who has just thrown a rope. It was, objectively, not accurate. It was also the best thing anyone had given Evelyn in a long time, and she folded it with tremendous care and put it in her coat pocket. "You can put it up somewhere," Lucy said. "I will," Evelyn said. "First thing." When the wagon finally came up the road, Caleb carried her suitcase out without being asked. He put it in the wagon bed, and she stood in the yard, and Lucy stood beside her, and the morning had opened up, the flat clouds breaking apart to let some actual light in, which felt either like a good sign or a cruelty. She couldn't quite tell which. She shook Caleb's hand because that was what you did, and his hand was large and rough, and he shook hers once, firmly, and let go. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." "Safe trip," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. There was a whole conversation in that, or at least the space where a conversation could have been, and neither of them moved into it. Then Lucy flung herself at Evelyn's middle and held on for a moment that stretched, and Evelyn held on back, and then Lucy stepped away and stood straight with her chin up, which was so clearly practiced, so clearly the posture of someone trying very hard not to do the thing they felt like doing, that Evelyn had to look away before she did the same thing. She climbed into the wagon. Mr. Holt clucked at the horses. The wagon pulled away down the road toward town, and toward Millhaven, and toward whatever waited at the end of 22 miles. She did not look back. She told herself she did not look back, and for about 30 seconds that was true. And then she turned and looked back and saw the 2 of them standing in the yard. Caleb with his hands at his sides and Lucy with her hand raised, not waving exactly, just raised, like a small flag in still air, and the cottonwoods behind them and the house and the particular way the morning light fell across all of it, and she turned back forward and kept her face very still. The road to Millhaven was long. Gerald Marsh's ranch was larger than Caleb's, more prosperous looking in a way that announced itself. The fence line straight and recently painted white, the house 2 stories with a proper front porch and glass in all the windows and curtains visible behind them. There were hired men in the yard when the wagon came in, and a woman Evelyn didn't know came to the front door and looked out at her, and everything about it was more than what she'd left behind. Gerald Marsh himself came out to meet her. He was 52, which she'd known from his letters. He looked like a man of 52 who had lived well and worked hard and arrived at a certain solidity, not unkind in his face, but closed in a way that had nothing to do with shyness. He was formal. He shook her hand. He said it was good to finally meet her, and she said the same, and both of them meant it in a technical sense without meaning much more. He showed her the house. It was well kept, and she could see the care in it, the order of it, the particular order of a man who runs his household the way he runs his ranch, efficiently, without sentiment. He showed her the kitchen and the parlor and the upstairs room that would be hers until the wedding, and at no point did she feel, walking through any of it, the particular kind of ease she felt walking into a house that suited her. That was not a fair comparison, and she knew it. A week in a place is not a life. Familiarity is not the same as belonging. She told herself this several times. That first evening, they sat in the parlor after supper and talked, and she tried to find the warmth in him, the thing under the precision that she hoped was there. There were moments when she caught something, a dry humor when he talked about his cattle operation, a certain pride when he mentioned the school he'd helped fund in Millhaven. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had built something and wanted a certain kind of woman to maintain it, and he'd been very clear about that in his letters, and she'd agreed to it, and here she was. The problem was she kept thinking about a rope, and a fence post, and a gate that knocked in the wind. She slept poorly. In the morning, she walked into a kitchen that was already running according to someone else's arrangements. The cook, a stout, efficient woman named Mrs. Dolan, who was pleasant and didn't need help and had a clear system and didn't want it adjusted. Evelyn stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a moment, feeling useless in a way she hadn't felt once in the entire week at the Reed Ranch, and that told her something she'd been trying not to know. She lasted 3 days in Millhaven before she admitted it to herself. Admitted was perhaps too strong a word, recognized more accurately. She was sitting in the parlor on a Tuesday afternoon with Gerald Marsh's copy of a ranching almanac he'd said she might find useful, trying to concentrate on information about winter grazing practices, when she put the almanac down and sat very still and looked at the wall and thought, I don't want this. Not him, specifically. It wasn't about Gerald Marsh. He had been nothing but correct, and they were getting to know one another in a way that was perfectly civil and deeply uncomfortable for both of them. And she could see, if she squinted at it hard enough, a version of the life she'd agreed to, and it wasn't terrible. It just wasn't right. Not right in the way that a shoe that doesn't quite fit is wrong, not badly enough to scream about, but persistent and getting worse with every step. She thought about Lucy's face. She thought about it quite a lot, actually. Lucy's face, and the word melancholy, and the drawing of the oversized hat. She thought about a kitchen in the morning and weak coffee, and a dog underfoot, and a man who spoke in sentences that were shorter than they needed to be because he'd been talking to nobody for a long time. On the 4th day, she wrote a letter to Caleb Reed. She didn't know what she was doing. She was very clear about that. She did not know what she was doing, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. The letter was careful and somewhat indirect, and its stated purpose was to fulfill her promise to Lucy and provide the address she'd said she'd send. She wrote it in the morning before Gerald Marsh came down for breakfast, and she sealed it and put it in her coat pocket, and she carried it around for 2 days before she gave it to the boy who collected the post. She also wrote to Lucy directly, separately, a letter full of vocabulary words and the description of a bird she'd seen from her window that she thought Lucy might find interesting, and that one she sent without hesitation. Then she sat with the problem of herself. The problem of herself was that she had come west to solve a practical situation, and she was still in a practical situation, and the practical situation had not materially improved by wanting something different. She had no money beyond what she'd brought. She had a teaching certificate and the clothes in her suitcase and a drawing of herself throwing a rope. She had technically an arrangement with Gerald Marsh that included a future and a home and a certain level of security, and arrangements mattered, and she'd agreed to it. She had also, in her fourth meeting over supper, asked Gerald Marsh if he had considered whether there was a need for a school in the area surrounding his ranch. The nearest schoolhouse was 6 miles off, and she'd noticed several children on neighboring properties during the few times she'd gone out. He'd looked at her over his fork. "There's a school in town," he said. 6 miles, she said. For young children, 6 miles is a long way. Most families manage. "I'm sure they do," she said, "but managing isn't the same as learning." He'd put his fork down. He looked at her with an expression that was not unkind but was very considered, the expression of a man recalibrating. "You're proposing to teach," he said. "Here." "Not yet," she said. "I'm proposing that it might be worth considering." "I married a woman once who was very good at proposing things worth considering," he said. "Tiring business." She met his eyes. He held her gaze for a moment, and then, surprisingly, the corner of his mouth moved in something that was almost humor. "I'm not saying no," he said. "I'm saying I need to think about it." That was more than she expected. It made her feel something slightly more complicated than before, which was both better and worse. What she did not expect was that the letter from Caleb Reed would arrive 6 days later. She'd sent hers on a Tuesday. His came back on the following Monday, faster than she thought likely, which meant he'd answered the same day or the next. She took it upstairs to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at it for a moment before she opened it. His handwriting was nothing like Gerald Marsh's precise script. It was a working man's hand, functional, slightly uneven, letters that pressed harder than they needed to, as if he was used to writing in conditions where the surface moved. "Miss Hart," it began, "Lucy received your letter and has read it 11 times by her own count. She says to tell you the word for this week that she chose herself is relentless, which she says describes Captain the Roadrunner who has eaten through the fence near the south pasture twice. I think she may be using it wrong, but she is firm about it. The ranch is fine. Weather has turned. Hope you are well. C. Reed." She read it 3 times. Then she put it in the pocket of her traveling coat where she kept the drawing and the folded telegram from Gerald Marsh, and she sat there thinking about what it meant that she was keeping both things in the same pocket. She wrote back the next morning. Longer this time, less careful. She told him that Lucy was using relentless exactly right, and he should tell her so. She described the bird again because she thought he might know what it was. She mentioned, almost as an aside, that she'd asked Gerald Marsh about the possibility of a school and what he'd said. She mailed it before she talked herself out of the length of it. The response came in 8 days, which meant he was thinking before he wrote. This letter was longer too. "Miss Hart, the bird you described sounds like a curve-billed thrasher. Common here. They're loud. Lucy caught one once, and it bit her, and she let it go. She cried for about a minute and then said it was brave and she respected it. The school question is worth raising. There are 12 children between here and the Southern Road who don't go to anything since the teacher left in September. Lucy misses learning. She makes me quiz her on the words, but I don't always know if her answers are right, and she knows this and may be taking advantage. The ranch is still fine. October was dry. The fence captain broke is fixed, but I don't have high hopes. C. Reed." She laughed. She didn't mean to. She was sitting at the small writing desk in her room, and she read the part about Lucy taking advantage of the vocabulary quizzes, and she laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes up from somewhere before you can decide whether it's appropriate. She covered her mouth. Mrs. Dolan was somewhere below, and the walls were thin. She wrote back that evening. She wrote that she would send vocabulary lists with answer keys. She wrote that the curve-billed thrasher sounded exactly like something Lucy would respect for biting her. She wrote that 12 children was enough for a small school, and if there was a willing space, she could draw up a simple plan. She sealed the letter and then sat for a long time looking at the sealed envelope. She was corresponding with a man she'd known for a week. She was corresponding with him in a way that was technically about his daughter, and technically about birds, and technically about vocabulary lists, and she knew perfectly well what it was also about, and she had absolutely no idea what to do with that knowledge. She was engaged, in the approximate sense, to Gerald Marsh. She was sitting in Gerald Marsh's house. She set the letter aside for the night. She got into bed. She lay awake for an hour. In the morning, she mailed it. Orkit. What happened next was not dramatic. That was the strange part of it. She had expected, if she was going to find herself in some sort of impossible situation, that it would at least have the decency to be dramatic about it. Instead, it happened the way most things happen. Slowly, quietly, through accumulation. She had been in Millhaven for 3 weeks when a letter arrived, not from Caleb, but from Mrs. Parson, the widow in Seco Flats she'd never actually met, who had apparently heard about Evelyn from Lucy and had taken it upon herself to write. Mrs. Parson's letter was cheerful and slightly chaotic, and mentioned 17 different people by name with minimal context, and buried in the middle of it was a single sentence that Evelyn read twice. The Reed girl is pining something awful, and her father is worse, though he'd die before he'd say so. Evelyn put the letter down. She was in the parlor. The afternoon sun came through the good curtains at the good windows. From below the hill, she could hear the Millhaven operation going on. Men and cattle and the ordinary machinery of a prosperous ranch. In the corner of the parlor, there was a shelf of almanacs and a clock that chimed on the hour, and a whatnot stand with a vase on it that she'd been very careful not to disturb. She thought, I know the difference between a life I could live and a life that is mine. She also thought, knowing that doesn't change anything. Not automatically, not without cost. She stood up. She walked to the kitchen. Mrs. Dolan looked up from the bread she was working. Is Mr. Marsh still in the south pasture? Evelyn asked. Won't be back till supper, Mrs. Dolan said. He's got get up. Evelyn nodded. She got her coat and went outside and walked the perimeter of the yard, which she'd learned to do when she needed to think. The day was cold and clear, the kind of clarity that the altitude brought, where everything looked slightly more itself than it usually did. The mountains to the west were snow-capped already, and the grass in the low fields was brown, and the sky above it was the particular blue of deep autumn, almost violet at the edges. She thought about her mother, a habit she'd kept since her mother died, when she had to make a decision that mattered. She thought about what her mother would have said. Her mother had been a practical woman, a sharp woman, a woman who had loved her husband without illusion and raised her daughter without sentiment. And she had said, once, when Evelyn was 19 and being sensible about something she didn't want to be sensible about, Evelyn, there is a difference between responsible and afraid. Make sure you know which one you're being. She stopped walking, stood in the cold yard and looked at the mountains. She was being responsible, she told herself. And then, or are you being afraid? And then, unhelpfully, Caleb Reed's handwriting pressing harder than it needed to onto the page. She went back inside. She sat at the writing desk. She did not write a letter. Instead, she took out the drawing Lucy had made, the hat with the oversized flowers, the arms thrown out with the rope, and she propped it against the inkwell and looked at it for a long time. What she felt was not simple. It was not a clean decision with clean edges. It was a tangle of things, obligation and longing, and the particular fear of a woman who has been alone long enough to be cautious about wanting, and underneath all of it, something that was just true, without arguments, the way some things are just true. She put the drawing away. She picked up her pen. She wrote, not to Caleb, but to the situation as it was. She made a list, which she was prone to doing when she couldn't see clearly. On one side, Millhaven, the arrangement, security, what she'd agreed to, what was reasonable. On the other side, she left it blank for a while, and then wrote, Lucy, 12 children with no school, a fence post, a fire, a man who answers letters the next day. She looked at the list. She folded it in half, and then in quarters, and then she put it in the small case under her bed where she kept her mother's poetry book. At supper that evening, Gerald Marsh talked about the coming cattle sales, and she listened and asked appropriate questions and helped Mrs. Dolan clear the plates. And when he asked her, over the last of the coffee, whether she'd settled in, she said yes, quite honestly, because she had settled in. The trouble was that settling was not the same as belonging, and she'd known the difference her whole life, and she'd chosen to ignore it because the alternative had seemed too uncertain. The alternative was still uncertain. She was very clear about that. But uncertainty and wrongness were not the same thing either, and she was getting tired of pretending they were. She told Gerald Marsh on a Thursday. She chose Thursday because it had been 3 weeks, and she'd thought about it every day of those 3 weeks, and she was not going to think about it for a fourth. She asked to speak with him after supper. They sat in the parlor. The clock on the whatnot stand ticked. She had prepared what she was going to say, and then she abandoned the prepared version because it sounded like a letter and this was a conversation. "I owe you honesty," she said, "and I'm sorry that I don't have an easy way to give it to you." He looked at her. His expression was careful but not, she thought, entirely surprised. "Go ahead," he said. "I came here to make an arrangement that would solve a practical problem," she said. "And you did the same, I think, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I've spent 3 weeks here trying to—" She searched for the right word. "Trying to want it. The life here. I've been trying to want it, and I don't. Not because of you. You've been more than fair." He was quiet for a moment. The clock ticked. "The wrong station," he said. She looked at him. "Your telegram," he said. "The first one. You said you'd gotten off at the wrong station." He folded his hands on his knee. "I wondered, when I got that telegram, whether it was only the station that was wrong." She held his gaze. "I think there may have been a few things," she said, as honestly as she could. He was quiet again for longer. He looked at the fire. She waited, because he deserved time, and she'd already taken a great deal of his. "There's someone in Seco Flats," he said finally. Not a question. "There may be," she said. "I don't know yet. I can't promise." He held up one hand, not unkindly. "Don't," he said. "I don't need to know the details." He looked at the fire a moment more. "I need a woman who wants to be here," he said. "Not one who's decided to make peace with it. I've had that in this house before." Something in his face moved briefly, and she understood that he was talking about his late wife, and she was not going to ask. It doesn't serve either person. She felt a rush of something. Not relief, not exactly, because relief doesn't usually come with this much weight attached to it. Gratitude, maybe, for the clarity he was offering her even when he was the one losing something. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm genuinely sorry." "Don't be sorry more than is useful," he said, which was the most Gerald Marsh thing he'd ever said. And she liked him considerably more in that moment than she'd been able to in 3 weeks of suppers. She left the next morning. She did not take the almanac on winter grazing practices. The stage to Seco Flats ran on Tuesdays. She spent the intervening days in the small rooming house in Millhaven that Mrs. Dolan's cousin operated, sitting with her suitcase and her books, and the drawing of the hat, and the very real question of what exactly she thought she was going to do when she got there. She didn't have an answer. She had 12 children with no school. She had a vocabulary list she'd promised to send. She had 3 letters in careful, irregular handwriting that pressed harder than it needed to. That was what she had. It was Tuesday before she let herself write one more letter, this one to Mrs. Parson, whose address she found at the bottom of the chaotic and cheerful letter she'd received, asking, carefully, as a practical matter, whether there was a place to board in Seco Flats while certain arrangements were being considered. Mrs. Parson's reply, which arrived with a speed that suggested the woman wrote letters the way Lucy did everything, immediately and completely, was 2 pages long and covered many subjects. But its essential message was yes, there was a spare room, it was comfortable, it had a good window, and nobody in Seco Flats was going to pretend they didn't know why she was coming back. Evelyn read this and thought, all right then. On Tuesday morning, she boarded the stage. She was not certain about what waited at the other end. She was not the kind of person who confused wanting something with being sure it wanted her back, and she knew enough about Caleb Reed after 1 week and 4 letters to know that he was not a man who would be easy about any of this, that the walls he'd built were not decorative, that he had his own arithmetic he was working through, and that even if she arrived in Seco Flats and found the situation as it seemed in letters, there was no guarantee of how any of it would unfold. What she did know was this. She had gotten off at the wrong station once, and it had taken her to a kitchen with bad cornbread that she'd fixed, and a child who threw a rope badly, and a gate that knocked in the wind, and a man who pressed too hard on the page and answered letters the next day. She knew the difference between a life she could live and a life that was hers. She got on the stage. Well, the cottonwoods were bare by the time she came through them. She hadn't arranged for transport from town, and the stage left her at the Seco Flats stop with her suitcase and the cold air and the particular sensation of a person who has made a decision and is now living in the 30 seconds before she finds out whether it was right. She hadn't sent word she was coming. She hadn't known exactly when she was coming, and also, she was honest about this with herself, She was afraid that if she sent word, she'd talk herself out of it on the way. She picked up her suitcase. She walked to Hennessy's store because she needed to start somewhere, and that was the place she knew. The man she'd spoken to the first time, Old Dunn, she now knew his name was sweeping the porch again. He looked at her. He looked at the suitcase. He did not look surprised. "Miss," he said. "Good afternoon," she said. "I'm looking for—" She stopped. She didn't need to say the name. He was already pointing up the road toward the north side of town, toward the cottonwoods, with the particular lack of surprise of a person who had been watching the shape of things from a porch for a long time. "He came in for supplies this morning," Old Dunn said. "Might still be at the feed store." She thanked him. She walked toward the feed store. She found Caleb Reed loading sacks into the wagon bed, which was exactly where she'd found him the first time, or close enough to it that it felt like something had come around in a circle. He was lifting a sack and he hadn't heard her yet, and she stood on the plank sidewalk with her suitcase and waited. He turned. He saw her. For a moment, just a moment, before he arranged his face back into the measured, careful expression she knew. She saw what was there. She saw it clearly. The thing that had been in his letters, pressing too hard on the page. She had no way of knowing whether any of this was going to go the way she hoped. She had 12 children and a teaching certificate and a drawing in her pocket and a week's worth of mornings in a kitchen that had felt like hers. And she had a lot of things still to figure out. And she was standing in the street in a town she'd ended up in by accident. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "The stage runs on Tuesdays," he said. "Yes," she said, "it does. You must have been in Mill Haven since—" 3 weeks and 4 days, she said. He looked at the suitcase. He looked at her. The arithmetic on his face was visible, just barely, the careful, silent adding up that he did when he was making sure he wasn't seeing something wrong. "Lucy's at school," he said. "In town. She'll be out at 4. "I know," Evelyn said. "I thought I'd wait." He looked at her for another long moment. His hands were still on the wagon siding, and he was still and she was still, and somewhere down the street a horse shook its head and the bit rattled, and the cold air moved between them with its smell of dust and coming winter. "All right," he said. The way he'd said it the first time, in the yard, when she'd said she'd wait for Lucy to come home from wherever she was. The same word, the same quiet weight to it. Not a welcome, not yet, but not a closing door. She picked up her suitcase. She set it in the wagon bed next to the feed sacks without asking. He didn't object. They waited for Lucy. Lucy saw her from half a block away and ran. She didn't call out first or stop to make sure she was seeing right, Jed. She just ran, the way children run when the thing they've been wanting shows up without warning, all of her concentrated into forward motion, braids flying, boots loud on the plank sidewalk, and she hit Evelyn at full speed with both arms going around her waist and held on like something that had been loose for 3 weeks had finally found its anchor again. Evelyn held her back. She pressed her face briefly into the top of Lucy's head and breathed and let herself feel it, the particular relief of being exactly where you're supposed to be, which is a thing you can only know in comparison to all the places you aren't. "You came back," Lucy said into Evelyn's coat. "I came back," Evelyn said. Lucy pulled away and looked up at her with an expression that was attempting to be composed and not quite achieving it. "I knew you would," she said. "Did you?" "I said so," Lucy said. "I told Pepper." From the wagon, Caleb watched without comment. He had his arms crossed on the siding, and his face held that careful, weighted expression she'd come to understand was not indifference, but its opposite. The look of a man who feels things sharply and has learned to stand very still when he does. He did not say, "I told you so," or "I knew anything." He was not that kind of man. What he said to Lucy was, "Get your things, we're losing light." The weeks that followed were not effortless. Evelyn was settled at Mrs. Parsons' boarding house, which turned out to be a large, warm, disorganized house on the north end of Seco Flats, run by a woman who was exactly as she'd appeared in her letters, loud, generous, perpetually in the middle of 4 things at once, and constitutionally unable to mind her own business, which in this case Evelyn chose to see as a benefit rather than a liability. Mrs. Parsons' house smelled like bread and lamp oil, and the 3 cats that lived in the kitchen, and Evelyn's room had a window that faced east and a quilt on the bed that had been made from flour sacks in a pattern that was clearly unplanned but was somehow perfect. She put Lucy's drawing on the wall above the washstand, as she'd promised. Every other morning she walked out to the Reed Ranch. Sometimes she took the road, which was longer. Sometimes she cut through the Alcott property with Old Dunn's nephew as an escort the first few times, until she knew the way well enough to go alone, which she did thereafter. The purpose of the visits was, formally, Lucy's lessons. This was the arrangement. Evelyn was taking over where the previous teacher had left off, working with Lucy in the mornings at the kitchen table. But the 12 children from the surrounding properties had become, within 2 weeks, a real problem for her to solve. She had already spoken to 3 families. She had written to the territorial school board with a proposal. She had identified a disused building near the East Road that might serve as a schoolroom if someone willing to do the work could be found. She presented this to Caleb over coffee on the second week, not asking his permission, but giving him the information because she thought he'd have something useful to say about the building. He sat at the table and looked at her proposal. 1 page, handwritten, practical, and read it carefully in the way he did everything, which was without hurry. "The Brower Building," he said. "That's the one. Ed Brower won't charge for it," he said. "He owed my father a favor for 20 years and can't pay it back now. My father's dead, so he transfers it. If you ask him, he'll say yes." She looked at him. "You'd know that." "I know most things about most people here," he said. Not proudly, just factually. "That's what 20 years gets you." She took that as an endorsement and spoke to Ed Brower the following day. He said yes before she finished asking. Things were building. That was the feeling of those weeks, the sense of something accumulating day by day, not in a way that was announced or rushed, but in the way that real things build, through work and proximity and the slow wearing away of caution. Caleb began to say more over coffee, not dramatically more, but measurably. An extra sentence, a question asked back, the occasional comment that was nearly an opinion rather than just information. Once, near the end of the 3rd week, she said something about a difficult family she was trying to convince to send their children to the school, and he said, without preamble, "Take something. Don't go empty-handed. The Kettners think gifts are honesty." She looked at him. "How do you know the Kettners?" "They bought a horse from me in '84 that turned out to be lame. I replaced the horse. They've trusted me ever since." He drank his coffee. "People remember how you behave when you've done something wrong, more than when you've done something right." She thought about that for the rest of the day. Lucy, for her part, was thriving in the specific way that children thrive when they have someone paying careful attention to them. Not just the affection, though that mattered, but the attention that takes them seriously. Evelyn taught her without condescension and without false encouragement, and Lucy responded the way a plant responds to actual sun versus the lamp held up to approximate it. She was sharp. She was genuinely, sometimes uncomfortably, sharp. The word of the week that Lucy chose in early November was precarious. "I chose it," Lucy announced at the kitchen table, "because of the school roof." Evelyn looked at her. "The Brower Building," Lucy said. "The roof at the east corner. I looked at it when Papa drove past." Caleb, without looking up from the harness he was oiling at the table, said, "I'll look at the roof." "Thank you," Evelyn said. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Might be worse than a look can fix." It was worse than a look could fix. He fixed it anyway, over 2 days with a neighbor named Tom Alcott, who seemed to appear whenever there was work and disappear when it was done. And he did not make anything of it, and she was learning to understand that this was how Caleb Reed showed things, not in words, not in gestures you could hold up and point to, but in the doing of things that needed doing for people he'd decided mattered. She was learning to read him the way you learn to read new country. You didn't look for the signs you were used to. You looked for the signs that were there. Quote, the first real trouble arrived in the 2nd week of November, which was early enough in the school's life that a strong wind would have ended it. Her name was Victoria Ashcroft. Evelyn had heard the name before she met the woman. Mrs. Parson had mentioned her. In fact, the way you mention a weather pattern you hope goes around. Victoria Ashcroft was the widow of Marcus Ashcroft, who had owned the largest cattle operation in the county until his death 2 years prior, and who had left his widow in possession of a great deal of land, a great deal of money, and a disposition that had apparently not been improved by either. She was 45, dark-haired, still handsome in the way that certain women are handsome when they've been beautiful and haven't quite forgiven the world for the difference. She came to Seco Flats with a small entourage, a hired woman who carried things, a lawyer from Santa Fe named Price, who seemed to exist entirely to make other people feel they were standing on uncertain legal ground. Evelyn met her at Hennessy's store on a Wednesday morning in November, which was accidental on Evelyn's part, and she suspected not at all accidental on Victoria Ashcroft's. She knew who the woman was immediately, which had more to do with bearing than recognition. Victoria Ashcroft had the posture of someone who expected rooms to arrange themselves around her, and they generally did. "Miss Hart," she said, which was the first thing she said, which meant she already knew who Evelyn was, which was itself information. "Mrs. Ashcroft," Evelyn said, because she'd heard the name often enough to attach it. "I've been meaning to make your acquaintance," Victoria said. "I've heard a great deal about you. The school teacher from Boston, all the way out here." She said this in a tone of mild bafflement that was clearly not bafflement at all. "What brings you so far from home?" "The West," Evelyn said, which was true and committed to nothing. Victoria looked at her with a measuring expression that she did not bother to conceal. "I understand you've been spending time at the Reed Ranch." "I've been teaching Lucy Reed, yes," Evelyn said. "How generous of you," Victoria said. "Caleb is lucky to have someone take such an interest. He's had a hard time of it, since Eleanor." Eleanor was, Evelyn knew, the name of Caleb's late wife. She noticed that Victoria Ashcroft used the name with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had been here through all of it. "He seems to manage well," Evelyn said. "He manages," Victoria said, with a slight emphasis on the word that turned it from a neutral statement into a subtle contradiction. "He's a stubborn man, always has been. Stubborn men manage things when they should ask for help." She paused. "I've known the family for years, you understand. I knew Eleanor. Lucy was born on my property, as a matter of fact, the closest ranch when Eleanor went into labor early. This was delivered as information but functioned as a boundary marker. I was here before you. I have history here that you don't." Evelyn said, "What? That must have been frightening." "It was," Victoria said, and for just a moment something genuine passed over her face, the memory of a real night with real fear in it, and Evelyn caught a glimpse of the person behind the performance. Then it was gone. "I only mention it because I want you to understand that I care about what happens to that child, to that family." "I understand," Evelyn said. "Good," Victoria said. She smiled, which was accomplished, and told nothing. "I'm sure we'll speak again." She moved away toward the counter, and Evelyn stood in the middle of Hennessy's store, holding her list of supplies for the schoolroom and feeling the conversation settle around her like a coat that didn't quite fit. She told Caleb about it that afternoon, just the facts, not her interpretation of them. He listened without interrupting, which was his habit. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What did she want?" he said. "I don't know yet," Evelyn said honestly. He looked at the table. Something moved through his jaw. "Victoria Ashcroft has wanted this land since Marcus died," he said. "She's been after 3 properties north of her boundary. 2 she's gotten. This one she hasn't." Evelyn looked at him. "Your ranch." "She made 2 offers in the year after Eleanor died," he said. "I said no both times. 3rd time she sent Price." He said the name the way you say the name of weather you don't like. "Legal letters about a boundary dispute from 1879 that my father and Marcus Ashcroft settled in 1882 and haven't been a problem since. But she's raising it again." "She's raising it again," he said. "Nothing's come of it yet. But Price is in town." He paused. "And now she's introduced herself to you." He said this last thing carefully, and she heard what was underneath it. Not suspicion directed at her, but concern for her. She was an unknown variable in a situation that was already complicated, and Victoria Ashcroft introducing herself to an unknown variable was not something either of them could afford to dismiss. "I haven't done anything that gives her leverage," Evelyn said. "I know," he said, "but she's looking for some." He nodded. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't ask him to, because some things were clearer left to take their own shape. The second piece of trouble arrived differently. Nora Fielding appeared in Seco Flats 10 days after Victoria Ashcroft, and her arrival was announced in advance by a letter to Caleb that Evelyn knew about only because Lucy, who had found the letter before Caleb opened it, came to her morning lesson with a face like compressed weather. "Aunt Nora is coming," Lucy said. "She said it the way you announced that the floodwaters are rising." "Tell me about Aunt Nora," Evelyn said carefully. "She's Mama's sister," Lucy said. She set her copybook on the table without opening it, which was itself unusual. "She came after Mama died to help. She stayed for a year. Papa—" She stopped. "They didn't get along." "I see," Evelyn said. "She thinks Papa can't manage," Lucy said. "She says so, not to him, but she thinks it where you can hear it." She looked up. "She's going to have opinions about you." "I expect she will," Evelyn said. "You should know that her opinions are usually wrong," Lucy said, with the precise dignity of a child making an official record. She thought Pepper was dangerous and he's not. She thought the school in town was good enough and it wasn't, since the teacher left. She thought— She stopped again. Something crossed her face that was older than 7 should carry. She thought I needed to live with her in Albuquerque. Evelyn set down her own pen and looked at Lucy. "What did your papa say?" "No," Lucy said, simply. "He said no, and she said he was being selfish, and he said she was being something that I'm not allowed to repeat." A small pause. "He said it quietly, but I was in the hall." Evelyn thought about Caleb Reed saying something quietly in a hallway and looked away before Lucy could see her expression. Nora Fielding arrived on a Thursday. She was 38, lean, fair-haired, where Eleanor had apparently been dark, with a face that would have been kind if the habit of worry hadn't rearranged it into something that looked more like judgment from a distance. She was not unkind, in Evelyn's estimation, not deliberately. She was a woman who had loved her sister and lost her, and had translated that grief into a fierce investment in managing the situation her sister had left behind, which meant Caleb and meant Lucy, and management as love had a particular flavor that other people found difficult to live inside. She arrived and hugged Lucy with real warmth, and then she looked at Evelyn over Lucy's head with an expression that was measuring in a very different way from Victoria Ashcroft's. Less calculation, more apprehension, which was almost worse. "Miss Hart," she said. "Mrs. Fielding," Evelyn said. They had supper together that evening, all 4 of them, and it was the most complicated meal Evelyn had sat through in Seco Flats, which was saying something. Nora directed most of her conversation at Lucy and Caleb, which was natural, and the questions she asked were designed to cover practical ground: the ranch finances, the state of the winter preparations, whether Lucy had been keeping up with her studies. All reasonable questions, all also functioning as a quiet audit of whether things were being managed properly. Caleb answered everything without warmth, not from hostility, but from the particular economy of a man who had already had this conversation and was having it again. It was the question about Evelyn that shifted things. "And what exactly is your arrangement?" Nora asked. She directed it at Evelyn with the determined politeness of someone asking a question they've been sitting on for an hour. "You're boarding in town, but you come out here every other morning," Evelyn said. "I'm teaching Lucy. I'm also setting up a school for the children in the area." "In Seco Flats," Nora said. "You're setting up a school in a town you arrived in by accident." It was not said with cruelty. It was worse than that. It was said with the tone of someone who genuinely thinks they are making a reasonable point. "The accident of how I arrived doesn't change what's needed," Evelyn said. "There are 12 children without a teacher." "And who's paying for this school?" Nora asked. "The families will contribute what they can. I've written to the territorial board. Ed Brower has donated the building." "So you're working for nothing," Nora said. "For now," Evelyn said, which is not unusual for a school getting started. Nora looked at her for a moment, and then she looked at Caleb with an expression that contained volumes. Caleb did not look back at her. He was cutting his meat with the deliberateness of a man choosing not to engage on the terms being offered. "Lucy," Nora said, "are you happy with your lessons?" "I know what precarious means," Lucy said immediately. "I'm sure you do," Nora said. "And relentless," Lucy said, "and fortitude, and tenacity, and melancholy." She listed them the way she'd memorized them, which was completely and without pause. "That's very impressive," Nora said, and meant it, which was the first entirely unguarded thing she'd said all evening, and Lucy felt it and sat up a little straighter. And Evelyn noted this because it was the detail that mattered. Nora Fielding was not an enemy. She was a frightened person who'd lost a sister and never quite stopped trying to hold on to what was left. That was different. Harder, in some ways, than plain hostility. The thing Evelyn did not anticipate was how quickly the two threats would find each other. It happened within a week. She didn't know the mechanics of it, whether Victoria Ashcroft sought Nora Fielding out, or whether Nora, alone in Secco Flats with her concerns and few allies, had moved toward the one person who seemed to share them. What she knew was that Mrs. Parson told her, on a Monday morning with a face that combined apology and inability to contain information, that the two women had been seen together at the hotel dining room twice in 4 days. They were talking for a long time, Mrs. Parson said. Price was there the second time. Evelyn set down her coffee. The lawyer. Yes. Mrs. Parson looked at her with an expression of genuine worry, which from this woman was bracing because she was not naturally a worrier. Nora Fielding has standing to raise questions about Lucy's welfare, about whether Caleb is providing a stable home. If someone with legal resources were to— I understand, Evelyn said. She did understand. She saw it very clearly, and the clarity was not comfortable. Victoria Ashcroft wanted the land. A custody challenge, or the threat of one, would destabilize Caleb in ways that a boundary dispute alone might not. A man fighting on two fronts, his child and his property, under financial pressure was a man in a weaker negotiating position. And Nora Fielding, whatever her actual intentions, gave legal and human texture to what might otherwise look like pure land grabbing. She told Caleb that afternoon. She told him plainly because she had come to believe that the only thing you could give this man that he would actually take was the truth without softening. He listened. He sat at the table for a long time after she finished. What does Nora think she's doing? He said finally. I don't know that she fully knows, Evelyn said. I think she genuinely worries about Lucy. I think Victoria Ashcroft is very good at finding the place where someone's worry lives and putting herself next to it. He looked at the table. Nora doesn't have the money for a custody action. She doesn't need money, Evelyn said carefully, if Victoria Ashcroft is providing legal resources. He was quiet again. The quiet was different from his usual quiet, heavier, pressurized, the quiet of a man who has been carrying something and just felt it get a great deal heavier. She's not going to take Lucy, he said. It was not a blustering statement. It was a very flat, very certain one, said in the tone of someone describing the edges of what they would tolerate from the world. No, Evelyn said. She's not. He looked up. What do you think we should do? She noticed the we. She was fairly certain he noticed it too, and chose to let it stand. I think you need to talk to Nora, she said. Not argue. Talk. She's not the enemy, and if you let Victoria Ashcroft make her one, you've made this worse. She paused. And I think you should speak to someone about the boundary dispute. Not Price's terms. Your own terms. With your own counsel. I can't afford a lawyer from Santa Fe. No, she said. But Tom Alcott's brother-in-law passed the bar last year in Albuquerque. Mrs. Parson told me. He's not experienced, but he's honest, and he knows New Mexico land law, and he owes Tom about 6 favors. He stared at her. How do you know that? Mrs. Parson, she said. He almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the face that preceded one, which she had learned to recognize and which she counted among the things she'd collected during her time here. I'll talk to Alcott, he said. And Nora, she said. He picked up his coffee. One thing at a time, he said. The conversation with Nora happened the following Sunday, and Evelyn was not present for it. She had not suggested she should be. Caleb told her about it afterward, briefly, sitting on the porch steps in the cold with 2 cups of coffee going cold in their hands, Lucy inside at the table drawing something. She's afraid I'm going to marry you, he said. Evelyn felt the sentence arrive somewhere in the middle of her chest and held herself very still. What did you tell her? That it wasn't her business, he said. Caleb. I told her that you are here as a teacher, he said, that Lucy has learned more in 2 months than in the year before, that whatever happens otherwise is not a child welfare concern. Did she accept that? He turned his coffee cup in his hands. She accepted that I'm going to do what I'm going to do, he said. She doesn't approve of— He stopped, looked at the yard, at the fence post he'd mended, at the pale November sky. She thinks this looks bad. You hear? Unmarried, and me. He stopped again. I know how it looks, Evelyn said. He glanced at her. Does it bother you? She thought about the question honestly. It bothers me that people have decided what it means before they've looked at what it is, she said. What it actually is doesn't bother me. He was quiet. Not the closed quiet, the thinking kind. What is it? He said. What you think it is. She was careful with this because she was careful with important things. A man who let a stranger stay in his spare room because his daughter asked him to, she said. And a woman who got off at the wrong station and found something she wasn't looking for. She paused. And whatever comes after that. He looked at her for a long time. His face did the thing where it held very still but wasn't still underneath. Victoria Ashcroft came by yesterday, he said. While you were in town. Evelyn set her cup down. What did she want? Made an offer on the north pasture, he said. Said it was separate from the boundary question. A fair price. His voice was flat. Very reasonable, very thoughtful. Said she understood times were hard, and she just wanted to help. What did you say? I said no, he said. Same thing I always say. And? He looked at his cup. She said she hoped I wasn't making decisions based on... He paused. Temporary influences. The words landed clearly. Evelyn understood what was meant. She was the temporary influence. The outside woman from Boston who had no real stake here, no history, no claim, who would eventually leave or make things worse, and on whose account Caleb Reed was refusing a fair price for land he couldn't afford to keep. She said that to your face, Evelyn said. She said it the way she says things, he said, like she's doing you a favor. Evelyn stood up from the porch step. She was not a person who paced when she was angry. She went still instead, which was different and perhaps more alarming. She stood in the yard and looked at the fence line and breathed the cold air and let herself feel it, the particular anger of being reduced to a category by a woman who didn't know her. She's trying to separate you from anything that gives you steadiness, she said. She knows a man fighting alone is easier to wear down than one who isn't. He looked at her from the step. Is that what you are? He said. Steadiness. It was not quite a question. She turned and looked at him. I'm trying to be useful, she said. Which was true and also not entirely the point, and they both knew it, and neither of them pushed further because the edge of a thing is not the same as the thing, and they were both still finding the shape of it. Inside, Lucy called out that she'd finished the drawing and wanted to show someone. Caleb stood. He picked up both coffee cups. He looked at Evelyn and said, with the economy of a man who chooses his words like he chooses tools, I'm not selling the land. I know, she said. And you're not a temporary influence, he said. She held his gaze. Something in her chest pulled tight and then released, the way something does when you've been waiting to hear a thing without knowing you were waiting. No, she agreed. I'm not. They went inside to see what Lucy had drawn. The drawing was of 3 people in a yard, one tall, one medium, one small, and a dog with an oversized tail. Above them, Lucy had written in careful, deliberate letters the best handwriting she'd been practicing for 2 months. Home. Neither of the adults said anything about it. Caleb put it on the mantelpiece above the fire. Evelyn looked at it there and thought about how a week had become 2 months, and 2 months had become this, a word written by a child in careful letters, placed over a fire, in a house that was becoming something its walls had forgotten how to hold. She knew, walking back to Mrs. Parsons that evening, with the cold air working its way through her coat, that things were not settled. The boundary papers were still in Price's office. Nora Fielding was still in town and still unreconciled. Victoria Ashcroft was still working angles that Evelyn could see but not yet fully counter. What she also knew was this. She had made a choice to come back to this town. Not to Caleb Reed, not yet. She hadn't been that certain, that far out ahead of herself. She'd come back to something she recognized as true. And true things, in her experience, had a way of becoming clear when you stood next to them long enough. She pulled her coat tighter against the wind coming off the mesa and walked through the dark toward Mrs. Parsons' lights. Behind her in the window of the Reed house, she could see the fire. The legal papers arrived on a Monday morning in the first week of December, delivered by Price himself, which was the kind of move designed to feel like an event. He came to the ranch directly, not to the lawyer's office, not to Hennessy's where a neutral party might witness the exchange. He came to the house at 8 in the morning when the ground was frosted and the air had the bite of real winter in it, and he handed Caleb an envelope with the practiced courtesy of a man who files things away for later about how people receive bad news. Caleb read the papers at the kitchen table while Evelyn sat across from him with her hands around her coffee cup and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say until she knew what she was dealing with. Lucy had been sent to feed the chickens, not because they thought she didn't know something was happening, but because she knew it entirely too well, and they needed 5 minutes without managing her feelings alongside their own. He read slowly. He always read slowly, not because he was slow, but because he read the way he did everything physical, with his full attention and without wasted motion. When he finished, he set the papers flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. "The boundary claim," he said, "and a petition for a welfare review." Evelyn felt the second part land in her chest. "Lucy, filed by Nora," he said, "but the language is prices." He said it without heat, which was almost harder to hear than anger would have been. "She's claiming the home environment is unstable. Specifically," he stopped, pressed his lips together. "Specifically, that there is an unmarried woman living in irregular proximity to the household, creating a situation that is not suitable for a child. The unmarried woman was her. She knew that without him saying it. She looked at the papers from across the table. "May I?" He pushed them toward her. She read through the welfare petition first. The language was careful and legal and managed to be insulting without using a single impolite word. Irregular domestic arrangement. Questions regarding moral propriety. The welfare of the minor child warrants examination by a qualified authority. It didn't accuse her of anything specific. It didn't have to. Implication, in legal language, was cheaper than accusation and just as effective. She set the petition down and looked at the boundary claim. It was longer and denser and cited the 1879 survey, which she knew had been settled, and introduced 3 additional reference points that hadn't been in the original dispute. A creek redirect, a fence placement from 1884, a variance in the original land grant that someone with knowledge of Ashcroft's interests had presumably spent time excavating. "How bad is the boundary claim?" she asked. "On its own?" He turned the pages back. "Tom's brother-in-law says it's contestable. The 1882 settlement is documented, but contesting it takes time and money, and they know I don't have either in excess." He looked at her. "Together with the welfare petition, if I'm in court on 2 fronts, the legal costs alone could—" He didn't finish. She finished it in her head. "Could break him. Not quickly, not dramatically, but the way water works on stone. Steadily, over months, until the shape of things is permanently different." "Where's Nora now?" Evelyn said. "At the hotel." He looked out the window. The frost was still on the ground, pale and indifferent. "She came by last night. After Price served the papers, she said she was sorry, that she didn't know it would go this far." "Do you believe her?" He thought about it honestly. "I believe she didn't understand what she was agreeing to," he said. "Nora's not a calculating person. She's a frightened one. That doesn't make it better, but it's different." Lucy came back in from the chickens with cold, reddened cheeks and straw on her coat and read the room in the way she always did. Quickly, accurately, without comment. She hung up her coat. She sat at the table. She looked at the papers and then at her father. "Is it bad?" she said. He looked at his daughter. "It's something to deal with," he said. "Is Aunt Nora trying to take me?" A pause. "She filed papers," he said. "That doesn't mean anything is decided." Lucy looked at the papers. Something moved across her face. Not fear exactly, more like a particular cold clarity, the expression of a child who has been through enough to know that adults saying nothing is decided doesn't mean nothing is wrong. "I'm not going to Albuquerque," she said. "No," Caleb said. "You're not." Lucy looked at Evelyn. "Can you make it stop?" Evelyn looked at this child, who had been asking her to stay in various forms since October, and felt the weight of what she was being asked settle on her with complete seriousness. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I'm going to try." She started with Nora, because Nora was the part of this that was still human rather than legal, and human problems required human solutions before the lawyers got to them and turned them into something else. She went to the hotel on Monday afternoon. She did not ask Caleb's permission, partly because it wasn't his to give, and partly because he would have tried to come with her, and this was a conversation that needed to happen without him in the room. Nora opened the door to her knock, looking like a woman who had not slept, and had been sitting with the particular company of her own regret for approximately 12 hours. She looked at Evelyn, and something in her face moved through 3 or 4 things at once. "I didn't plan this," Nora said. Not as a defense. More like she needed to say it to someone who wasn't a lawyer. "May I come in?" Evelyn said. Nora stepped back. The room was small and tidy. Nora kept things tidy the way some people keep a grip on whatever is still within their control. There was a chair by the window and a second chair by the small writing table, and they sat in them without ceremony. "Tell me what you actually want," Evelyn said. "Not what the papers say, what you want." Nora looked at her hands. "I want Lucy to be safe," she said. "She's safe." "I want her to be in a—" Nora stopped. Eleanor trusted Caleb completely. Always. She said he would take care of everything if anything happened, and she was right. I know she was right. He has taken care of everything. She looked up. "But he's alone with her. And then you appeared, and I didn't know who you were, and Victoria said—" "What did Victoria say?" Evelyn asked carefully. Nora looked at the window. "She said you were a woman who'd left her fiancé in Millhaven under circumstances that weren't clear, that you were boarding with Mrs. Parson with no real income and no real plan, and that Caleb was—" She stopped again. That Caleb was a lonely man who might not be seeing things clearly. Evelyn sat with that for a moment. It was not entirely wrong as a description of facts. It was entirely wrong as an interpretation of them. That was how the best slanders worked. "What Victoria Ashcroft wants," Evelyn said, "is the Reed land. She's made offers twice and been refused. The boundary claim is leverage. The welfare petition is leverage. You are—" She stopped herself from saying a tool, because that wasn't kind and Nora wasn't a bad woman, and the truth could be delivered without maximizing its sharpness. "You are someone whose genuine concern for Lucy has been directed toward her purposes." Nora was quiet for a long time. The window showed the Seco Flat Street, gray and cold, a horse tied at the post outside Hennessy's, 2 women walking with their coats pulled close. "I know she wants the land," Nora said finally. She mentioned it. She said it was separate from her concern for Lucy. "Nothing she does is separate from her concern for that land," Evelyn said. Another silence. Longer this time. "If I withdraw the petition," Nora said slowly, "she'll be angry." "Yes," Evelyn said. "She'll still have the boundary claim." "Yes. But the boundary claim without the welfare petition is a land dispute, not a—" She found the right word. "Not a story. The welfare petition is what makes it a story. It's what makes people in this town look at Caleb and see a question mark rather than a neighbor." Nora looked at her with an expression that was hard to read but had something honest in it now, something that wasn't performing concern or performing anything. "What are you to him?" she asked. Honestly, Evelyn thought about Lucy's drawing on the mantelpiece. The word in careful letters. "I don't have a word for it yet that fits," she said, "but I'm not a temporary influence, and I'm not a mistake he's making. I came back here by choice. The school is real. The children are real." She paused. "Lucy is real. And whatever else is happening, it is slow and it is honest, and it is nobody's business but ours." Nora looked at her for a long moment. Evelyn did not look away. "Eleanor would have liked you," Nora said finally. It came out with something complicated behind it, grief, and the particular ache of recognizing that the world keeps making people worth liking even after the ones you loved most are gone. "I'm sorry I never knew her," Evelyn said, and meant it. Nora nodded. She looked out the window again. "I'll withdraw the petition," she said. "Give me until tomorrow morning." Evelyn stood. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Nora said. "Just—" She stopped. "Take care of her, both of them." "That's what I'm trying to do," Evelyn said. The petition was withdrawn by Tuesday noon. Price filed the notification with an efficiency that suggested Victoria Ashcroft had anticipated this possibility and had contingency thinking already in motion, which turned out to be accurate. By Wednesday, the story Victoria had been quietly circulating about Evelyn in Seco Flats had sharpened and accelerated. Evelyn heard pieces of it from Mrs. Parson, who heard everything eventually, and from two of the school families who came to her directly with the uncomfortable expressions of people bearing news they wish they didn't have. The story was not dramatic. That was its sophistication. It was composed entirely of facts in an order that implied a narrative. A woman who had broken an engagement, who had no permanent residence, who was living on the charity of a boarding house while spending her days at a widower's ranch, who had inserted herself into a family that had managed without her. None of it was a lie. All of it was a misrepresentation so thorough it functioned as one. "Let it go," Mrs. Parson said to Evelyn on Wednesday evening, with the expression of a woman who has lived long enough to know how communities process stories. "People here know Caleb. They'll come to their own conclusions." "When?" Evelyn said. "These things take time." "We don't have time," Evelyn said. "The boundary hearing is set for the 18th. That's 2 weeks. If people are uncertain about Caleb, about his situation, some of them won't show up for him when it matters. And it's going to matter." Mrs. Parson looked at her. "What are you thinking?" "The school opening," Evelyn said. She'd been planning a small gathering to mark the first week of formal classes, a thing for the families, something that showed what the school was and who it served. She'd been thinking of it as modest. "I want to move it up. I want to do it this Saturday. That's 3 days. I know. The building's not—" "The roof is fixed," Evelyn said. "The floor needs sweeping. The desks need to be set. Tom Alcott said he had 4 chairs he'd lend. Ed Brower has the benches." She looked at Mrs. Parson. "Can you cook?" Mrs. Parson's expression moved from concern to something approaching interested. "What kind of question is that?" she said. "I need food for 30 people," Evelyn said. "Maybe more." Mrs. Parson put her hands on her hips and looked at the ceiling in the manner of someone doing calculations. "The Kettner women can bake," she said, "and Ada Brower makes a venison stew that would make a man cry." "Saturday afternoon," Evelyn said. 3 o'clock. Every family with children in a 10-mile radius. Every neighbor of Caleb's who's ever traded with him or fixed a fence with him or bought a horse." She paused. "And the whole town." Mrs. Parson was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Victoria Ashcroft will come." "I know she will," Evelyn said. "She'll stand there and watch you do this, and she'll smile, and she'll be very gracious about it, and she'll find the angle." "She can try," Evelyn said, "but she's going to have to do it in front of everyone." The 3 days were not comfortable. They were productive, which is different. Evelyn worked from early morning to late evening each day, moving between the Brower building and Mrs. Parson's kitchen and the homes of the school families, and she was not always graceful about it. She snapped at Tom Alcott on Thursday when he moved a bench to the wrong wall, which she immediately apologized for, and she burned a batch of cornbread on Friday morning because she was doing 3 things at once, and she sat on the floor of the Brower building Friday afternoon, surrounded by slates and chalk, and 2 borrowed lamps, and a map she was trying to get straight on the wall, and thought for about 10 minutes that she had severely miscalculated the scale of what she'd taken on. Then Lucy arrived with Caleb, uninvited and clearly unable to stay away. And Lucy surveyed the room with her hands on her hips in an unconscious imitation of Mrs. Parson and said, "The map is crooked," and pointed, and Evelyn moved it 2 inches to the left, and it was straight. And Caleb picked up the other end of a bench without being asked and put it exactly where it needed to go. And they worked together until dark, in the near silence that had become, over 2 months, the most natural thing between them. He drove her back to Mrs. Parson's that evening. At the road to the house, he stopped the wagon and didn't immediately signal the horses forward. "I know what you're doing," he said. "Fixing up a school," she said. "More than that," he said. She looked at the road ahead. "People need to see what this is," she said. "Not the story Victoria's telling. The real one." "You can't control what people decide," he said. "No," she said. "But I can give them something true to look at and let them decide that." She paused. "You have neighbors, Caleb. People who've known you for years. They just need—" She searched. "They need a reason to move. People want to do the right thing. They mostly just need the occasion." He was quiet. She could feel him thinking beside her, the particular quality of his silences when he was working something through. "If this goes wrong," he said, "Saturday. If Victoria turns it into something, then we're no worse than we are now," she said. "But I don't think it goes wrong. He looked at her. In the dark, with just the thin winter moonlight, his face was difficult to read, but she'd gotten better at reading it by less than full light. "You're a determined woman," he said. "I am," she said. "I know that's not always easy to be around." "I didn't say it wasn't easy," he said. He looked forward again, lifted the reins. "Saturday," he said. "Saturday," she said. They came. That was the thing she hadn't been fully certain of, despite her confidence to Caleb. She hadn't known, not for sure, whether they would come. But they came. The Kettners came with their 3 children and the older daughter who was too old for the school but came anyway. The Alcotts came, Tom and his wife and the 4 children, and Tom's brother-in-law, the young lawyer from Albuquerque, whose name was Daniel Reyes, and who had the quiet, attentive look of someone learning the lay of land he'll need to navigate. The Brower family. The widow Ferris with her 2 boys. 8 more families from the road south and east. People Evelyn had visited and spoken to and sent word to through the network of Mrs. Parsons' considerable social reach. Old Dunn came from Hennessy's and stood at the back with his hands in his pockets. The Gruber family. The minister's wife, without the minister. 34 people, and then 6 more who arrived after 3 o'clock, having heard at the last moment and come anyway. Nora Fielding came and sat in the back row, quietly. She nodded at Evelyn. Evelyn nodded back. Victoria Ashcroft came at 3:15, with Price slightly behind her, and she was exactly as Mrs. Parson had predicted, gracious, composed, smiling at people she knew, and being introduced to people she didn't with the fluid ease of a woman who has operated at the center of rooms for a long time. She found a place to stand near the side wall, and she watched with an expression of pleasant attention. Evelyn saw her come in and noted it and kept moving because there was a room of 40 people and 12 children and a school to open, and this was what mattered. She spoke simply. She stood at the front of the room with the crooked then straight map behind her and the 4 benches of children in front and the adults around the walls, and she said what the school was, a place for the children of this part of the territory to learn, freely, together, built on the donation of a building and the willingness of families and the understanding that a community that educates its children is making a bet on its own future. She said she was glad to be in Sicko Flats. She said she was glad specifically to be here. Not passing through, not temporarily placed, but here as part of this. She did not make a speech about herself. She did not address the rumors. She made instead the speech of a person who is already where she is, already doing what she's doing, already belonging to a place, and doesn't require the place's permission to believe it. She had Lucy read aloud. This was planned. A short passage from a natural history text about the landscape of New Mexico, which Lucy read in a clear, steady voice without stumbling, and which was also, though Evelyn hadn't said so, a demonstration. A 7-year-old reading naturally, with comprehension and confidence in front of 40 people. Nobody in that room who had watched Lucy do it could walk away wondering whether the teaching had been real. When Lucy finished, there was a silence and then applause. Real applause. The kind that means something because it's not automatic. Lucy sat down and Evelyn could see from across the room that she was working very hard not to show how pleased she was, which was the exact expression she'd inherited from her father. The food came out. Mrs. Parson had not underdelivered. Ada Brower's venison stew was everything that had been promised. Cornbread, biscuits, dried apple cake. The room filled with the sound of people eating and talking, the particular noise of a community gathering that has shifted from formal to comfortable, and Evelyn moved through it answering questions about the school calendar and the curriculum and whether she needed any help with supplies. And 3 families offered labor and 2 offered materials, and one man she barely knew said, quietly, that he was glad she'd come back, which she thanked him for and held close. It was in the middle of this that Daniel Reyes found her. He was standing near the door with a cup of coffee and the expression of someone who has been waiting for the right moment. He was 26, with a careful manner and a way of choosing words that reminded her slightly of Caleb, though for different reasons. "Miss Hart," he said, "I've been looking at the boundary papers." "Tom told me," she said. "Thank you for your help." "I haven't helped yet," he said. "I've only looked." He glanced around the room, at the gathered neighbors, at Caleb near the window talking to Tom Alcott with an ease she hadn't seen in him for weeks. There's something in the 1879 survey that I don't think Price has looked at carefully. A notation in the county record from 1881, before the settlement, that establishes the creek position as reedland by the original grant, not by the 1879 survey. If the 1879 survey is subordinate to the original grant, the entire boundary claim falls. Evelyn looked at him. You're certain? I'm certain it's worth arguing, he said carefully. I'm not certain how a judge will rule, but the notation exists and Price hasn't cited it. Either he missed it or he's hoping we did. Can you argue it? He looked at his coffee. I passed the bar 8 months ago, he said. I've done 3 cases, 2 of which were uncomplicated. This is not uncomplicated. I know, she said. Can you argue it? He met her eyes. Yes, he said. She nodded. Then argue it. The gathering was winding down, people collecting children in coats, the particular slow dispersal of a community event that has gone well. Not perfectly. There had been a moment when 2 of the younger children had knocked over a lamp, and there had been a small crisis and a broken glass, and old Dunn had said something politically unfortunate about the school board that she'd had to redirect smoothly, and it was not seamless. None of it was seamless. But it was real, and the people leaving looked different from the people who had arrived, by some small but measurable degree, and that was what she had needed. She found Caleb near the door as the last families were leaving, his coat on, Lucy at his side, already half asleep, standing up. How did it go? He asked. He'd been in the room the whole time, but he was asking for her assessment, which she understood as its own kind of trust. Daniel Reyes found something in the county record, she said. She told him quietly, while Lucy leaned against his arm with her eyes closed. His expression went through several things in the space of a few seconds. The original grant notation, he said. You know about it? My father mentioned it once, he said slowly. Years ago. I didn't know it was still in the county record. I assumed... He stopped. I should have looked. Daniel looked, she said. That's what matters now. He stood for a moment in the doorway of the school that his neighbor had built and his other neighbor had fixed the roof of, and that was full of the remains of food that a dozen women had made, and he looked at all of it, at the map on the wall, at the benches, at the slates stacked in the corner, with the expression of a man who is recalculating something at a fundamental level. Evelyn, he said. She waited. When this is over, he said, the hearing, whatever happens with it. He stopped, looked at Lucy asleep against him, looked back at her. I'd like to talk about what comes after. She felt the sentence move through her with the particular quality of something she'd been waiting for long enough to have stopped letting herself wait for it. Yes, she said. I'd like that too. He nodded. He carried Lucy to the wagon. Evelyn stayed to help Mrs. Parson and Ada Brower with the remaining food and the putting away of things, and she worked with her hands and her body while her mind was somewhere else, doing something between hope and certainty that she didn't have a good word for. The hearing was on the 18th of December, in the county courthouse in the neighboring town of Brant, which was larger than Secco Flats, and had a proper courtroom with benches, and a judge who had been on the bench for 11 years, and was not, by all accounts, a man who enjoyed having his time wasted. He was presented on the morning of the 18th, with the boundary claim from Price on one side and Daniel Reyes on the other, and Daniel, who had prepared with an intensity that suggested he understood what was at stake in ways beyond the legal, presented the 1882 settlement and the original grant notation and the 1881 county record with a clarity that she felt, sitting in the back of the courtroom, was better than good, better than what 8 months of experience should have produced. There was something about a person arguing for something real, something they actually believe matters, that comes through in the work. Price objected twice. The judge overruled him twice. The third time, the judge looked at Price over his glasses and said, in a tone that closed the matter, Counsel, this notation has been in the county record for 40 years. If you missed it, that is not the court's problem. It took the judge 45 minutes to rule. He found for Reed on the boundary claim. He found the 1879 survey subordinate to the original grant. He noted that the 1882 settlement between Caleb's father and Marcus Ashcroft had already resolved the matter, and that reopening it had been, in his word, inadvisable. Price gathered his papers without visible reaction. Victoria Ashcroft, who had come to the hearing and sat in the front row with her spine perfectly straight, rose and left before the judge had finished speaking, which told Evelyn everything she needed to know about how that conversation with Price would go later. Caleb sat at the table for a moment after it was over, very still, the way he went still when he felt things. Then he turned around and looked at the back of the courtroom and found her in the third row between Tom Alcott and Daniel's wife, and he looked at her with the full, unguarded, unmanaged expression she had only glimpsed before. Not the face before a smile, but the face of a man who has just been handed back something he'd been braced to lose. She held his gaze. She did not look away. She let herself have the moment fully, without hedging it or preparing for it to be less than it was. Tom Alcott slapped Daniel Reyes on the back hard enough to make the young lawyer stagger and said something loud that made the judge look up from his papers. Daniel looked slightly pained and extremely pleased. The Alcott wife, a practical woman named Helen, who Evelyn had come to genuinely admire, pressed Evelyn's hand once and said, "Good," which was in the economy of this community a great deal. Nora Fielding, who had also come, quietly, in the back row on the opposite side, waited until most people had filed out and then found Caleb in the aisle. Evelyn watched from a distance. She couldn't hear what was said. She saw Caleb listen and then nod, and then, with the carefulness of a man who doesn't offer things lightly, put one hand briefly on his sister-in-law's shoulder. Nora looked like someone who had been holding something heavy for a long time and had just been allowed to set it down. They drove back to Seco Flats in a loose convoy. The Alcott's wagon, Daniel Reyes on horseback, Mrs. Parson in the Brower wagon, Caleb and Evelyn together, with Lucy between them talking without stopping for approximately 11 miles. She talked about the judge's voice. She talked about what Daniel had said about the original grant. She talked about how she had watched Victoria Ashcroft leave in the way she'd left, which Lucy described as like someone who was pretending to be fine, which means they're not fine. She talked about whether the word for that was dignified or proud or something else. Stoic, Evelyn offered. Lucy tried it. Stoic, she said, but a bad kind. Stoicism isn't inherently bad, Evelyn said. It is if you're doing it because you lost, Lucy said, with some certainty. Caleb said, that might just be called pride. Pride is bad if you lost? Lucy asked. Pride can be bad if it keeps you from admitting something true, Evelyn said. Lucy thought about this. Like what? Like that you were wrong, Evelyn said. Lucy absorbed that. Victoria Ashcroft was wrong, she said. Yes, Evelyn said. Are you ever wrong? Lucy asked, directing this at Evelyn with the directness of a child who is asking a real question. Frequently, Evelyn said. Lucy looked at her. About what? About how long things take, Evelyn said. About how difficult people will be. About, she paused. About thinking I knew where I was going. Lucy looked at her for a moment with those eyes that saw more than they should. You mean the train, she said. Among other things, Evelyn said. But it was right, Lucy said. The wrong station was right. From the other side of Lucy, Caleb said nothing, but Evelyn felt the particular quality of his silence, the one that meant he was listening more carefully than he appeared to be. Yes, Evelyn said. It turned out to be. They came through the cottonwoods as the December sun was going low and red over the mesa, the cold air sharp and clear and carrying the smell of snow somewhere to the north. The ranch house sat in its low place between the fence lines with its lamp already lit in the window, because Mrs. Parson had ridden ahead with the Browers and had gone in to light it, which Evelyn had not known she was going to do, and which she felt, seeing it, as one of the small and unannounced kindnesses that held communities together from underneath. Caleb stopped the wagon in the yard. He helped Lucy down. He helped Evelyn down. And when her feet were on the ground, he held her hand for a moment before releasing it. Not long, not dramatic, a moment that contained something, and then he let go and they went inside. The fire was laid. Mrs. Parson had left bread on the table and a note that contained, in her handwriting, more exclamation points than any victory celebration in legal history had probably warranted. Lucy read the note aloud and laughed. Caleb made the fire go, and Evelyn made coffee, and the three of them sat at the table in the warmth with the December dark outside the windows. And nobody said very much. And it was not the silence of people who have nothing to say. After Lucy was in bed, they sat at the table with the lamp between them. It was like the evenings of October, and unlike them. Same table, same fire, same two people, but everything between them had moved, had layered and deepened and become itself through the accumulated days. "I meant what I said," he said, "at the schoolhouse, about talking." "I know," she said. "I'm not—" He turned the coffee cup. "I'm not a man who makes things easy." "I know that too," she said. "This isn't—" He stopped, tried again. "This isn't a practical matter. I'm not asking for practical reasons." She looked at him across the lamp. He met her eyes and held them, and in his face was everything he was. The careful man, the stubborn man, the man who had lost someone and rebuilt around the absence and had not expected to be standing on the other side of it wanting something again. "Caleb," she said, "I got off a train in October without knowing where I was going. I found a kitchen with cornbread burning and a little girl who threw a rope at a fence post and called it a success, and I left and came back because—" She stopped. Let the truth of it sit before she said it. "Because I'd rather be in an uncertain place that's real than a comfortable one that isn't. That's not a practical calculation." He looked at her. "No," he said, "it isn't." "So whatever you want to say," she said. "When you're ready, I'm not going anywhere." The fire settled. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun, quiet and without announcement, dusting the yard and the fence and the cottonwoods and the mended gate post in the dark. The lamp between them was steady. The house held the warmth the way it had been holding warmth all winter, the way old houses do, imperfectly, with gaps in the corners and a draft under the back door, and a window that didn't quite seal, but enough. More than enough. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and left his hand there. She turned her hand over, held on. Neither of them said anything more. There was, for the first time in a long time, nothing that needed saying. The snow that had started quietly on the night of the hearing did not stop until morning, and when Evelyn woke at Mrs. Parsons and looked out her east-facing window, the world had been reorganized overnight into something cleaner and less complicated than it had been the day before. The yard, the road, the roofline of the building across the street, all of it white and still, the way the land gets when winter finally commits to itself and stops negotiating. She stood at the window for a while with her coffee and thought about a hand held across a table in lamplight, and about what came after that, and about the particular quality of not needing to say anything because the saying had already happened in every other way. She did not let herself rush it. That was important. She had learned, in the months since October, that the things worth having in this territory were not the things that came fast and announced themselves. They were the things that came the way the land itself came to you, slowly, through repeated presence, through learning to read signs you hadn't been trained to read. The curve-billed thrasher, the way frost looked different at altitude, the vocabulary of a man who said more in 5 words than most people said in 50. She dressed. She made her bed with the care of someone who doesn't rush the beginning of days. She took Lucy's drawing down from the wall above the washstand, looked at it once, and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, close. Then she went to see what the morning needed. What the morning needed, as it turned out, was practical and unromantic, and entirely typical of December in New Mexico. The cold had come down hard overnight, and one of the Brower children had woken with a fever, and the school was not meeting that day, and half of Seco Flats was occupied with the particular winter logistics of a frontier town: wood, water, livestock, the 100 small emergencies that cold weather manufactures without warning or apology. Evelyn spent the morning at Mrs. Parsons', helping with the kitchen and writing letters. One to the Territorial School Board confirming enrollment numbers for the spring grant application, one to a book supplier in Santa Fe whose catalog she'd been working through for weeks, trying to stretch a small budget into a real library. She wrote these letters with the focused attention she brought to practical things, and she did not let her mind wander too far, because there was work, and the work was real, and the work was, in its own way, part of the same thing as everything else. After noon, she went to the Reed Ranch. The road through the cottonwoods was different in snow, quieter, the bare branches holding white along their tops, the ground unmarked except for bird tracks and the passage of some animal overnight that she couldn't identify. She walked it alone, as she had for months now, and she knew it the way you know a path you've taken enough times that your feet remember it separately from your mind. Caleb was at the barn when she came into the yard, doing something with a length of harness that needed repair. He looked up when he heard her on the snow. Something in his face did what it always did now when he saw her. That small, almost invisible shift that she'd learned to recognize as the equivalent, in this man, of what other people expressed with considerably more noise. "Roads are bad," he said by way of greeting. "I managed," she said. "I can see that." He looked at the harness and back at her. "Lucy's inside. She started a new drawing and won't let anyone see it." "Ominous," Evelyn said. The corner of his mouth moved. She said, "It's a surprise." "For who?" He looked at the harness. "Both of us," he said. "I think." She went inside. Lucy was at the kitchen table with paper and a pencil, and her arm curved around the drawing in the posture of someone protecting state secrets. She looked up when Evelyn came in and immediately increased the protective curve. "Not yet," Lucy said. "All right," Evelyn said, and went to make tea, and did not look at the table, which was its own kind of gift. They had a quiet afternoon, the three of them in and out of the house in the easy pattern of people who have stopped having to arrange themselves around each other and have started simply being where they are. Lucy finished the drawing and showed it to Evelyn first. Evelyn was not sure what to make of this ordering, except that it felt right. And it was of a woman and a man and a child standing in front of a house. The woman and the man side by side, close enough that their shoulders touched, the child in front of them with her arms spread wide as if presenting the house to an audience. Above the house, in Lucy's careful letters, was the word forever. Evelyn looked at it for a long time, long enough that Lucy started to look worried. "Do you like it?" Lucy said. "I think," Evelyn said carefully, "it might be the best word for a house I've ever heard." Lucy's expression relaxed back into satisfaction. "I thought of it myself," she said. "I know," Evelyn said. She showed it to Caleb when he came in. He stood at the door with his coat still on and held the drawing and looked at it in the particular way he had of looking at things that mattered, fully, without rushing. When he looked up, he looked at Evelyn, not at Lucy, and something passed between them across the kitchen in the late afternoon light that was not quite a question and not quite an answer, but was, she thought, the thing that lives between those two and makes both of them possible. "Lucy," he said, "go feed Pepper." "Pepper already ate," Lucy said. "Feed him again." Lucy assessed the situation with the accuracy that had always been her most troublesome gift. "You want to talk to Evelyn," she said. "Go," he said. She went, loudly, with the heavy-footed theatrics of a child who wants her departure noted. The door to the back of the house closed. Caleb set the drawing on the table. He took his coat off and hung it on the hook and stood in the kitchen with the expression of a man who has been thinking about something for several days and has decided it's time. "I'm not good at this," he said. He said it the way he said honest things, directly, without apology, just the fact as he understood it. "I've been trying to think of a better way to do it, and I don't have one." "Then just do it the way you have," she said. "It's worked so far." He looked at her across the kitchen. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not at Mrs. Parsons. Here. Permanently. As my wife, if you'll have me." He stopped. "Let that sit." "Not because of the land or because Lucy needs a mother, though she does, but because the house is different when you're in it and I'm different when you're in it, and I stopped pretending 3 weeks ago that those were things I could go back to not minding." She looked at this man, this careful, difficult, not easily given man who had fed a stranger his last good cornbread, and fixed a gate and answered letters the next day, and held her hand across a table, and was now standing in his own kitchen telling her the truth without dressing it up in anything softer than it was. She thought about a platform in October, a train pulling away, a town that wasn't hers, and a little girl who said, "You're here," like it was already decided. "Yes," she said, "that's my answer." He crossed the kitchen and he kissed her, which he had not done before. And it was not particularly graceful because neither of them had been practicing, and the kitchen was small and she was still in her coat, but it was real, which was the only requirement she'd ever had. From the back of the house came Lucy's voice, loud and entirely unsurprised. "Did she say yes?" Caleb pulled back. "Were you listening?" "The door doesn't close all the way," Lucy said, with the cheerfulness of someone making an architectural observation. Evelyn laughed. It came up from somewhere she hadn't known was that full, and she let it come, all of it. And Caleb stood in front of her with that almost smile that was more than a smile, and they listened to Lucy in the hall saying, "I knew it, I knew it, I knew it," to the dog, with a conviction that had apparently never wavered since October. They married on Christmas Eve. Evelyn had not planned it for Christmas Eve specifically, but Mrs. Parson had said, with the authority of a woman who understood community logistics, that people would come if there was food and occasion and something worth coming for. And Christmas Eve was a night when people were already inclined toward warmth and gathering. And why not? It was not a large wedding. It was also not a small one. The Brower building that had become the school became, for one evening, a place of a different kind of gathering, with the desk pushed to the walls and the borrowed benches brought back, and evergreen branches that Tom Alcott's children had cut from the hills tied along the windows with whatever they had available, which included a length of red ribbon that Mrs. Parson had been saving for 3 years for something appropriate. Nora Fielding came from Albuquerque. She had written after the hearing a short letter, careful and honest, that acknowledged she had been used without meaning to be and was sorry for the difficulty it had caused, and that she hoped, in time, there might be something easier between them all. Caleb had written back 3 sentences that were, for him, generous. Nora had come. She sat in the front row next to Mrs. Parson, who had opinions about the flower arrangements and had expressed them freely. Daniel Reyes came with his wife. The Kettners, the Alcotts, Ed Brower, and his wife Ada, Old Dunn from Hennessy's, the widow Ferris with her boys. 31 people in a schoolroom on Christmas Eve, which was impractical, and a little cold because the stove in the corner had not fully warmed the space yet, and people kept their coats on for the first part of the ceremony, which gave it a certain authentic frontier quality that no amount of planning could have manufactured. Lucy was the one who carried the ring. This had been her own proposal, advanced 3 days before the wedding, with a seriousness that foreclosed debate. She had a small wooden box that had been her mother's, a jewelry box with a carved lid, and she had cleaned it and polished it and put Caleb's grandmother's ring inside it. A simple band of gold, old and slightly worn, that Caleb had brought out of the drawer where it had been sitting for 4 years, and she carried it to the front of the room with the solemnity of a diplomat bearing something irreplaceable. The justice of the peace was a man named Holcomb, who drove out from Brant, and who had married a great number of people in a great number of circumstances, and had the unflappable quality of someone who has seen what people look like when they mean it versus when they don't, and who clearly understood within 2 minutes of arriving that this was the first kind. The ceremony was short. Short ceremonies are, in Evelyn's view, almost always better than long ones. They keep what matters at the center and don't give sentiment time to curdle into performance. She stood next to Caleb in the schoolroom she'd built in 6 weeks out of a disused building and a community's willingness. And she said the words she meant, and he said the words he meant. And Lucy stood at Caleb's left side, holding the wooden box with both hands and leaking tears silently down her face in a way that she appeared entirely unaware of, which was both heartbreaking and very Lucy. When it was done, Holcomb said the pronouncement, and Caleb kissed her again, and this time there was nothing graceless about it, because they'd had 3 weeks of practice and also because the room erupted in a noise that left no room for self-consciousness. Lucy had apparently been holding the wooden box so tightly during the ceremony that her knuckles had gone white, and when she finally set it down on the nearest desk, she shook her hands out like they'd gone numb, and Evelyn caught her hand and held it between both of hers until the feeling came back, and Lucy looked up at her with that face, that clear, certain 7-year-old face, and said, "Now you stay." "Now I stay," Evelyn said. "Forever," Lucy said. The word from the drawing. "Forever," Evelyn said. Mrs. Parsons' food was very good. Ada Brower's venison stew appeared again, which was beginning to feel like the official dish of every significant occasion in Secco Flats. Tom Alcott had brought a fiddle, which he played with great enthusiasm and middling accuracy, and the result was dancing of a similarly enthusiastic quality. And the cold was no longer a problem because there were 31 people in a medium-sized room and a working stove, and the particular heat of people who are genuinely happy and not trying to appear so. Nora Fielding found Evelyn near the side wall mid-evening, during a pause between songs. She looked different from the woman who had sat across from Evelyn in the hotel room, less compressed, less braced against things. She looks like Eleanor sometimes, Nora said. She was watching Lucy, who was dancing with Tom Alcott's oldest daughter with the confidence of someone dancing in a kitchen rather than a room full of people. When she laughs like that, the way her eyes go. Tell her that, Evelyn said. She'll want to know. Nora glanced at her. You think so? She wants to know about her mother, Evelyn said. Caleb does his best, but it's hard for him to talk about her. You knew Eleanor. She paused. That's not a small thing for a little girl. Nora was quiet for a moment. She watched Lucy spin past with her partner, both of them slightly out of step and not caring. You're good at this, she said. It was not effusive, it was a considered statement. I thought you were... I don't know what I thought. Someone passing through. I thought that too for a while, Evelyn said. What changed your mind? Evelyn looked across the room. Caleb was talking to Daniel Reyes near the stove, and she could see from the way he held his coffee cup and the angle of his shoulders that it was a good conversation, an easy one. The posture of a man whose worst immediate trouble is behind him and who is still adjusting to not having to brace against everything. I kept thinking about a kitchen in the morning, she said. It sounds small. It isn't, Nora said. No, Evelyn agreed. It isn't. But this must... The school opened to its full enrollment in January. It said 14 children in the end, because 2 families she hadn't initially reached had heard about the Christmas gathering and come to find her after. The territorial board approved the grant in February. A small stipend, barely enough, but real. Official recognition that what she'd built was a school and not a temporary arrangement. She moved into the ranch house without event, which was itself a kind of grace. There was no dramatic transition, no formal adjustment period. She had been in that kitchen so many mornings for so many months that moving her 3 books and her suitcase into the spare room, and then into the room she shared with Caleb, felt less like arriving and more like completing something that had been in progress since October. The ranch had its difficulties. January was hard on the cattle, and 2 animals were lost to the cold, which cost money they didn't have to spare. The fence captain the Roadrunner had broken required, it turned out, more than the repair Caleb had done in November. And there was a 2-day project in February that involved Tom Alcott and a great deal of profanity and the replacement of 3 posts. The school stove needed a new flue pipe in March. None of these things were small, and none of them was the end of anything, which was what life looked like when it was actually being lived rather than planned from a distance. Evelyn had a letter from Gerald Marsh in February. Polite, brief. He had married, he said, a woman from Santa Fe, a widow, someone he'd known for years. He wished her well. She read it once and wrote back briefly and wished him the same and meant it, and set it in the small correspondence file she kept in the school desk, and thought about him perhaps twice more that year, both times with the warmth she felt toward anyone who had the decency to be honest, when it would have been easier not to. Victoria Ashcroft did not disappear. People rarely do. She still had her land and her money and her hired lawyer and her position as the largest landowner in the county, and she moved through Seco Flats with the composed bearing of a woman who has not revised her opinion of herself despite evidence. She spoke to Evelyn at Hennessy's store in February with the studied pleasantness of someone who has put a thing in a drawer and closed the drawer, and Evelyn returned the pleasantness with equal measure, because that was what the situation required, and because she had no energy for a prolonged Cold War with a woman who had lost the battle she'd been fighting. What Evelyn had learned in the months since October was that the people who try to diminish you are almost always fighting something that has nothing to do with you. Victoria Ashcroft had wanted land and had used people's softer fears to reach for it, and she had failed, and now she had to live in the same town as the evidence of that failure. That was its own consequence. Evelyn didn't need to add to it. The spring thaw came late, as it always did at altitude, and when it came it was not gradual but sudden. A week of cold, and then 3 warm days that turned the ground soft and filled the creek and brought the first birds back, and the cottonwoods put out their first leaves in a green that looked almost impossible after the long brown of winter. Evelyn stood at the kitchen window on a morning in early April with her coffee and watched the light come across the yard and thought about a morning in October when she'd stood at a different window in a different house and looked at those same trees going gold, just arrived, not knowing yet what any of it would become. She was 7 weeks pregnant. She'd known for 2 weeks and had said nothing yet, not from fear, but from the desire to hold it close a little while longer. the knowledge of it, the private weight of something new beginning before anyone else could put their expectations around it. She had told Caleb the night before, quietly, in the dark, and he had been still for a long moment, the way he went still when things landed, and then he'd pulled her close without saying anything, and she'd felt his breathing change, and that was enough. That was everything. Lucy did not know yet. That conversation was being planned with the care it deserved. She was thinking about how to begin it when Lucy came into the kitchen in her nightgown, with her hair still flattened from sleep and Pepper at her heels, and went to the stove with the practiced movement of someone who knows where the coffee things are kept. "Weak," Evelyn said, before Lucy could pour too much. "I know," Lucy said, with the dignity of someone who has been managing her own coffee since she was 5. She sat at the table and they were quiet together the way they had learned to be quiet, comfortably, without filling every space. The morning light came through the window and fell across the table, across the surface where they'd done 100 lessons, and the vocabulary lists and the reading practice and the long discussions about words that led somehow to discussions about everything else. "Lucy," Evelyn said. How do you feel about the word increment?" Lucy looked up from her coffee. She was suspicious of this opening. It was too early in the morning for vocabulary without context. "What kind of increment?" "A small one," Evelyn said. "Something added by degrees. Something that makes a thing larger, slowly, until the size of it is different from what it was." Lucy studied her, those eyes clear and careful and always working. "Like the school getting bigger," she said. "Adding more children." "Like that," Evelyn said. "Or like the cottonwoods," Lucy said. "Adding leaves, not all at once." "Yes," Evelyn said. "Exactly like that." Lucy looked at her coffee cup and then back at Evelyn, and something moved across her face that was older than 8 should carry, that same quality Evelyn had noticed from the very first day. The understanding that arrived before the explanation, the certainty that preceded the evidence. "Is the family getting bigger?" she asked. Evelyn looked at her. At this child who had prayed for a mother and thrown a rope badly and chosen the word relentless and written forever over a house, and held a wooden box with both hands until her knuckles went white. "By one more," Evelyn said. "Eventually. Slowly. By increment." Lucy was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. She looked at her coffee. She looked at the window. She looked at the yard where the cottonwoods were doing what they did every April. Then she said, "Boy or girl?" "I don't know yet," Evelyn said. "I want a brother," Lucy said with the decisive quality of someone issuing a formal request. "I've thought about it, and a brother is better. A sister would argue with me." "A brother might argue with you too," Evelyn said. "Not as much," Lucy said. "Boys aren't as good at arguing." Evelyn thought about pointing out the statistical weakness of this claim. She decided to let it stand. Caleb came in from the early chores and looked at the two of them at the table and read the room in the way he'd always been able to. The way that had nothing to do with what was being said and everything to do with what was underneath it. He poured his coffee. He sat down. Lucy looked at her father. "I know," she said. He glanced at Evelyn. "She asked," Evelyn said. He nodded. He looked at Lucy with that love, that complicated, tired, vast parental love that she had watched him carry for almost a year now. The love that doesn't announce itself because it's too busy doing things. "How do you feel about it?" he said. "Good," Lucy said simply. And then, because she was Lucy, "I want a brother." "That's not really up to wanting," he said. "I know," Lucy said. "I'm just telling you my preference so you have the information." Caleb looked at Evelyn across the table. The lamp between them, the coffee, the morning, the child distributing her preferences to the universe. Something in his face moved into the expression she loved best in him. Not the almost smile, but past it, the real one, the one that was still rare enough to feel like weather clearing. "All right, Lucy," he said. The morning went on. The school bell, which was a real bell now, a small iron one that Ed Brower had found in a storage shed and cleaned up and mounted on a post outside the Brower building, would ring at 8, and there were 14 children who would arrive in its range, on horseback and on foot and in wagons, children who had spent the previous winter without a teacher and who had more to catch up on than any one year could hold. There was the spring planning to think about, and the fence repair that the thaw had revealed, and a letter to the book supplier in Santa Fe that Evelyn had been composing in her head for a week. There was the ordinary forward movement of a life that had enough in it to be difficult and enough to be good. And the difficulty and the goodness were not in competition with each other. They were part of the same thing. She would think, in the years that followed, about what it meant to get off at the wrong station. Not as a metaphor. She had never been comfortable with metaphors that made things tidier than they were, but as a literal fact, as something that had happened in a real October on a real platform, a woman with a suitcase and a letter and a plan, walking off a train because she heard what she wanted to hear instead of what was said. What she came to understand was this: it wasn't that the wrong station had been secretly right all along, arranged by some larger hand. That was too clean, too neat, too much the kind of story that required the world to be organized in ways it wasn't. What was true was something harder and more honest, that she had made a mistake, and the mistake had put her in a place where she had to make a choice, and the choice had been hers, and she had made it, and then she had made it again and again. She had chosen Seco Flats. She had chosen to come back. She had chosen to stand in the schoolroom in front of 40 people and be herself without apology. She had chosen the uncertain and real thing over the comfortable and hollow one, again and again, on days when it was clear and on days when it cost her something. That was not a story about fate. It was a story about choosing. The baby came in November, in the cold, in the ranch house, with Mrs. Parson in attendance and Tom Alcott's wife Helen, who had done this 3 times, and brought a competence that Evelyn was extremely grateful for. It was not an easy labor. Evelyn was not a woman who would pretend otherwise, later, when Lucy asked what it had been like. She said, "Long and hard and worth it," which was the honest answer, and Lucy had written it down in her copybook, which Evelyn discovered later and which she did not make Lucy remove. The baby was a boy. Lucy, informed of this after the fact, came into the room with the expression of someone whose formal request has been granted and stood at the edge of the bed looking at the bundle in Evelyn's arms, with the same clear, certain directness she had brought to everything since she was old enough to look at anything. "He's small," she said. "He'll grow," Evelyn said. "Does he have a name?" "James," Caleb said, from the chair beside the bed where he had been sitting for the past 4 hours, with the particular stillness of a man who has been through this before and knows that the only thing to do is stay. Lucy tried the name. "James Reed," she said. She looked at the baby. She looked at Evelyn. She looked at her father. "That's a good name," she said, with a gravity that made all 3 adults in the room, despite everything, smile. She climbed onto the edge of the bed, carefully, and she looked at her brother for a long time without touching him. Then she said, to nobody in particular, "I knew our family wasn't finished." Nobody answered her. There was nothing to answer with. The fire was going in the room, and the November wind was at the window, and the lamp was low and warm. And Caleb's hand was on Evelyn's, and Lucy was on the edge of the bed with her knees pulled up, watching over the smallest Reed the way she watched over everything she had decided to love. Completely, without reservation, as if the decision, once made, was simply permanent, which, Evelyn thought, was perhaps the only way to do it. Not because the world cooperates, not because love is a thing that protects you from hardship or loss or the long, difficult work of staying, but because some things are true. And truth, in her experience, does not require the world's permission to be what it is. She had gotten off at the wrong station. She had found, in the wrong place in the wrong town, in the kitchen of a man who fixed gates and answered letters the next day, the life that was actually hers, not handed to her, not arranged for her, chosen, with everything she had, one morning at a time, until it became the only life she could have meant. That was the whole of it. That was enough.